Like, I think that people are largely ruled by their memories because all you know of your life is what you remember happening. And at the same time, memory is kind of this murky, sort of inaccurate recollection of what happened.
Welcome to the Flowing Through Bowl, a platform dedicated to discussion and exploration of art and the creative process. For this week's episode, I had a conversation with Emma Kalff. Emma is an artist from Denver, United States, who creates strange, otherworldly images that evoke a sense of displacement and unease. Emma's painting process is akin to collage, where she'll paint the landscapes in her images in plein air, and then add her subjects in by painting from photographs to create paintings that are layered and off-kilter. So, I'm going to start where I start with everybody, which is just tell us a bit about yourself and how you became an artist.
I think that I became an artist largely because my mom made a really big effort when we were kids, my sister and I, to take us to art shows and galleries and museums. We were kind of always looking at something or going to a little jam session or and our house was full of books and paintings and music. And so I think being around that all the time kind of prepared me, paved the way, I guess, for me to be an artist. And then I got really lucky when I moved to New Orleans when I was about 22. And I befriended the founder of the Academy of Fine Arts in New Orleans because I was working as a model. Like I was modeling for artists. I did that for a few years in my early 20s. And the founder, whose name is Ausequis Ozals, he kind of took me under his wing and he let me study at the school on a work exchange program.
That's fun.
And that really completely changed my life, actually. And so, yeah, I think it was a combination of how I grew up and just that lucky break with getting to go to that school.
So that's really interesting because I feel like we don't necessarily have, and it's a question that I've just added to this list that I forgot I didn't actually add previously. But I feel like we don't actually have, or like society doesn't necessarily always value art in the same way that it should. And I think the fact that you were raised in a family where art was considered valuable or is considered like something to be looked at and to be observed and to kind of be taken notice of. I think that's really nice. I feel like we don't often get that. So I guess the question I wanted to ask you is like, do you think that society values art?
Do I think that society undervalues art?
Yeah, or just values it in terms of in the way that it should do.
I think that society is really obsessed with art, but doesn't value how much time
Hmm.
it takes to make it.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, I think that that became pretty apparent to me during COVID, like kind of how important art was in quarantine for people.
yeah.
If you think about being in quarantine and if you didn't have music or television or movies or podcast, anything creative, it would have just been so much more devastating. And I think, yeah, today we live in this kind of rapid speed environment and we're exposed to art in a really fast-paced way. So I think we're kind of saturated with it and we're around it all the time, but I don't think that people really understand what it like how much work goes into it
Hmm.
to making it.
And how do you think we could change that though?
Um, well, you have this question about should artists be more transparent, or
Hmm.
you've had that conversation, should
Yeah.
artists be more transparent with kind of their process on social media? I think that might be one thing. Um, just just talking about it with each other. And I don't know necessarily that we have to change it though, because I think there's something
Yeah.
magical about someone who's not an artist being able to just click a button and watch a movie that like changes their life.
Hmm.
And it's the artist's job to do all the work, and it always has been and it always will. And maybe we would stain someone's experience a little bit if we try to make it about how much work it takes.
See, I think that's actually a good point. This idea of like actually the artist is supposed to do the work, but I do also feel like it would be nice for people to understand just the amount of work that goes into it, because I feel like there's always this misconception of artists as like, and it's very kind of dated, but it's also very true, where like you just get up and make work and then you go sleep and it's like that's it. When actually there's so many different levels to being an artist, because like there's so many different skills you need to know and hats you have to wear. Like what are kind of some of this? There's probably the most surprising skills that you've had to learn, or things you have to do as an artist that you weren't really prepared for.
Yeah, I think one thing is learning how to handle the fact that being an artist isn't linear.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so for example, like I used to work on a farm. I used to work on farms a lot,
Wow.
and working on a farm is tremendously difficult, but if you say you have 5 hours to work in the afternoon, then you can get X amount of work done in those 5 hours, right? This is like a question of what you can physically accomplish in 5 hours. And if I go to the studio for 5 hours, I don't know what I'm gonna get done, like, I
Hmm.
could get a whole painting done, or I could just sit there and, like, ruin an entire painting and then have to start it again.
Yeah.
And there's something really difficult about that, and also the fact, other aspects of this sort of non-linear process are you can make a painting and it can sell tomorrow, or you can make a painting and it can sell in 10 years. So you're
Yeah.
essentially doing work and not knowing how much of it you're gonna get done and not knowing when it's gonna come back and pay you. And I think that that's like, learning to kind of navigate that is really difficult, and, um, learning to be by yourself also, because I mean, as my understanding is that all artists go through this, but I think for me, I definitely go through periods where I just really am not feeling creative or like
Hmm.
making anything, and that can last a week or a month or a year. And when you're working professionally, you have to maintain the level of production that you have, and you have to send your work to galleries or whatever contracts you're under. And you have to navigate that essentially by yourself because you don't have a boss. Um, and so that's been really difficult, to kind of navigate that. And those are things that, they don't teach you in art school.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So that's interesting. I actually had this conversation probably about half an hour ago with an artist from Australia, which is super fun. And she was saying about how there are things as artists that you can't do by yourself. You always need other people to help you do stuff. And it's kind of the consideration that you have to also remember, like, you can't do everything yourself. Like, I feel like artists are always expected to be everything. They're expected to be the business person, the social media star, the actual creator. You're expected to be everything, but you can't be because you don't have all of those skills. And you'll have some strengths, some weaknesses. You have to ask people for help here and there. I think it's really important, actually. Is that something you found yourself? Like, would you say you have any particular strengths or weaknesses?
Strengths and weaknesses. Yeah, I think my strength is creative. I kind of usually always have a million ideas going on.
Hmm.
So in that sense, I don't find it that difficult to like find subject matter for my paintings. Whether or not I'm feeling driven to make them is a different story. But
Yes.
my weakness is certainly on the business side. And I've been to a business school online for art. It's called the MBA program, Mastering the Business of Art, which is a really cool resource for artists. I like to shout that out whenever I can because I think it's hard to kind of discern what are good tools on the internet and what are scams and stuff for artists. So that was a really good program that I went through. But yeah, that's I don't have a natural like business mindset, so I really have to study it and really try and make an effort and make myself do all that stuff, the admin and the business and the outreach and the social media and all that stuff. But yeah, I think you make a really good point. Like nobody functions alone and no one builds their career alone either. It just takes a tremendous amount of work and luck, frankly, and small little interactions compounded over time that determine your success. Um,
Yes, I think I spoke to two artists last week. Wait, what day one? No, this week. One last week, one this week. Can't remember when I speak to people. I speak to 200 people. Yeah, so I spoke to an artist last week called Anna McDonald and an artist this week called Susan Stillman. And they're both older artists. And the one thing that they kind of, the one thing that I learned from them is that it's easy to forget in this society that all the way, and it kind of goes back to what we're saying, like all the work you're creating now, you may not see the dividends from that for decades. Just because you're creating work now doesn't mean it's going to sell. Just because you're creating work now doesn't mean that's what you're going to be doing in 20, 30, 40 years' time. That you have to remember, like, art is a lifelong process. And, as Susan said, she was like, if you're lucky enough to live a long time and be able to still be making art in 40 years, you want to still feel just as joyous about it then as you are now. So it's about kind of finding a way to work in which like you're able to kind of enjoy yourself, but also obviously make money, but also kind of realize that it's not all going to happen overnight. Because if you wanted to happen overnight, you'd probably be doing something different. You'd probably be dancing on
yeah,
TikTok. Um, or not even just that. You have to also remember, like, if you peak, where do you go from there? So I feel like because I see a lot because I talk to a lot of artists and I see a lot of artists really struggle with the idea of like not being quote unquote successful enough so soon. And it's like it's very easy to watch somebody else and be like, oh, I want to be like them. I'm very much forgetting that, you're on your own journey, which is easy to say. It feels very different. But you're on your own journey and the way you're going to approach creativity is so different to everybody else. So it's like you
yeah,
have to remember, like, just do what you can on the days you're able to, and then everything else will take care of itself.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think there's like a level of comfort in that too.
Hmm.
Yeah, I find myself like I want to be successful, but I also totally get what you're saying with peaking and then not knowing
Hmm.
where to go. And yeah, I think that would be really difficult to handle at any age, but definitely
Hmm.
at a younger age where you still have
Yes.
decades to go in your career. And then, people start to expect a certain thing from you. If you got
Yes.
famous off of one
Absolutely.
show that you sold out one time, and then everybody just associates you with that sort of art, and that might not necessarily even be what you want to be making. Um,
Yes.
yeah, it's tricky. It's very tricky. And it's like there's no guarantee at all of anything. Like I was
Yeah.
having this conversation with a friend the other day about there's sort of this trifecta of traits that you have to have. You have to be talented and you have to be I think the other one was like talented and like perseverant. Like you have to continue to make things constantly even when it's hard.
Hmm.
And then the third thing you have to have is luck.
Hmm.
And it's like, so you can be really talented and really good at what you do, and you can be consistent and perseverant and produce a ton of work and not have that third element of luck, and
Yes.
it just won't happen for you. Um,
Yeah.
and it's just that's just this difficult reality that I think all artists kind of sit in.
Well, I really agree with that. I feel like the older I get, the more I realize a lot of things are about timing. Because it's also like, is this, especially particularly like online, like, is this social media driven world the best time for you to be producing the work you're producing? Like, does your work fit in, or does your work have a place in this kind of like technologically crazed world? Because I feel like that plays a large role in like how people disseminate their work, for instance. And it's like, does your work hold people's attention for long enough? Is your work quote unquote interesting enough? And it doesn't have to necessarily be. But then if it's not, it's like, then how are you contextualizing your work? How are you making sure that people understand it? I feel like I think a lot of things are about timing. I think that's definitely what I've learned from just knowing a lot of artists and talking to a lot of artists and seeing a lot of artists kind of careers change and grow. It's really interesting, actually.
Yeah, yeah, and it's hard to contextualize paintings because there's so much that goes into them, and then if you just see an image of the
Mm,
final product,
yeah,
you don't know how big it is or where it is or how they made it or what it's painted on or um yeah, and it's also hard, sometimes I think about my social media feed, and I've started making reels to like
mm,
show the process. But then if you go on my page, it's just these images of the process and not the work. So it's like, what are you making? And so
mm,
it's like this really hard balance to strike between showing your process and showing the final product. And they're really two separate things. And at the end of the day, after the work of art is sold, the process is sort of irrelevant. The artwork is going to live, however long and however many people are going to see it. It's going to kind of live its own life. I think the process gets kind of forgotten after that, but it's certainly interesting to talk about and kind of see online.
I also feel though, I don't know if like showing the process in terms of like speed edits are just like enough. Because I always say to people, and this is not I love to see, so I always say to people when I can, because I love to give people advice that I never take. And that is like do voiceovers. Have a reel with your process, but talk about your process as well. Don't just show your process. Because if you talk about your process, people are going to be more engaged because like we hear your voice. Voices are very personal. And I feel like maybe because I do a podcast, it's just easy for me to be like, yeah, cool, I'll just send a random voice message to people. But I always feel like if people hear your voice, they'll have more of a personal connection. Therefore, they'll be like, oh, actually, I feel like I know this person a bit better. Therefore, like if you talk over your reels and talk about your process and why you've chosen to do what you do, it's going to stop people a bit more. It's going to, attract more attention because it's like, oh, actually, let's listen to this now. I don't know. For me, at least for me, if somebody has like voiceover reels, I'll always listen and stop and watch because I'm like, this is interesting. I want to know about the process, not just see the process personally.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've heard that too. I feel like I'm like up until now been too shy to kind of like
Yeah,
put it out there like that. But no, it's a good point. I think any sort of like human
yeah.
aspect to social media is more engaging, or in art, frankly. It's
Just
like
in life.
yeah, yeah.
It's a reason that I will send voice messages to artists that I don't know, um, just randomly because it's personal. It develops a better understanding straight away because you speak to somebody, you understand what they mean. When you text somebody, there's a lot of interpretation. And like for me, like I like to kind of know. I like kind of like to know if I say to you like, "Oh, I like your work," I want you to hear that I like your work, not just know that I like it. There's a very different thing there. So for me, I'm like, just send my solution to everything is just send voice messages to people. That's my solution.
Yeah.
Literally, just have your voice there, have your face there if you want it. You don't have to have your face there, but you can if you want to. Like, kind of try to figure out, even if you're like shy, even if you're introverted, even if you know, you prefer to be behind the camera, there are ways you can incorporate personality into your reels, into your work, into your social media that is going to be comfortable for you. You don't have to dance in front of your work. It's not necessary.
Yeah.
But there has to be some way in which you can be comfortable being more personal. So I think it's really important personally.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Yeah. It's like just another hat you have to wear as an artist.
And actually, what are other hats you have to wear as an artist?
Well, so I feel like there are multiple selves
Yes.
to the artist. Like there's the self of kind of when you're alone in the studio just making work and nobody else is there. Um, there's the professional self of like how are you going to present yourself
Mm,
to people that you're working with. Uh, and then there's a third kind of administrative hat that's
mm,
like
yeah.
just the hours that you spend or that I spend on the computer, logging my inventory and sending emails and all that stuff. Yeah, there's so much more to it, I think, than people realize even going into the career. I didn't realize how much would go into it. But yeah, it's a lot of juggling and timing and being presentable. Like I really try to be professional and on time when I'm, dealing with gallery owners or, you know, you with the podcast or anything like that. Because I feel like the art world is already so ambiguous.
Mm,
So like going the extra step and making it easy for people to work with you in a professional sense and sort of having reliable products, like products that are like physically reliable, like artwork that lasts a long time and that is like in good condition and well framed and well varnished and all of that sort of thing is sort of an easy way that I've found to it makes it easier for people to work with you because
Hmm.
everything is already so mercurial and sort of wishy-washy in the art world. It's all sort of the entire market is essentially based on like emotion and
Hmm.
whatever else, this factor that you can't really name
Yeah.
in the art world. So if you can kind
Yeah.
of, if I feel like it, you can do little things like that that make it easier, yeah, easier to work with you.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's a good point. I think being presentable, and I think actually just presenting yourself, like applying for opportunities, applying for group shows, applying for things, seeking out new opportunities. I think that's also very important. It's something that people don't really talk about often enough. Like, like writing grants and stuff, like, just there's so many things that you kind of have to consider. And actually, do you actually have any advice for aspiring artists?
Yeah, my advice would be just keep on pursuing it and keep on reaching out because I think it really is sort of a numbers game.
Mm.
Like I made this spreadsheet because I researched all these galleries in the US that sell kind of the sort of paintings that I make. And it ended up being like 120 galleries. And
Wow.
so, and I'm not through emailing all of them, but I've emailed about 80 of them. And then following up and da da da, here's my portfolio, follow up again. And eventually, actually, most of the ones that I emailed responded, and most of them said no.
Mm.
But I did get into a pretty decent, like really good gallery actually in Denver, called A Bend that I'm working with
Mm.
now. So anyway, if you look at kind of the end result of that, it's like, okay, I'm working with this good gallery in Denver. That's really exciting. The work that went behind that was this whole spreadsheet and essentially like 79 rejections
Mm.
and months of researching all of those galleries and emailing them and reaching out. So it's like that's sort of this hidden underworld of the artist experience, I think, because there's this really deep mythology around artists about being discovered.
Mm.
And that's true whether you're an actor or a musician or a writer or a painter. There's this myth of like, oh, well, one day I just, bumped into someone or someone came into my studio and then there we were and then I was famous. And it's like
Mm.
really what you have to do is kind of promote yourself and find opportunities for yourself. And that I think comes down to numbers. And I think if you can get yourself to a point where you're not discouraged by a no answer, like a um or not being discouraged by lack of response, I think you'll get really far. You just have to research the proper opportunities and then like continue to present your work to them.
Yeah. And that's actually really solid advice, actually. I think that's really good advice. 'Cause I think it's easy to want to just try to apply to any and every gallery. But it's actually like if you do more research and if you really kind of think about where you fit in or where you belong or kind of like where you think you might be accepted, then I feel like that kind of gives you a better insight into like where your career can align and who your career can align with. I think that's also very important to look at contemporaries and be like, well, actually, this person here, Chris work that is similar to mine. It's not the same, but it's similar. Like, where are they showing? And actually, one thing I always have people to do, as if I have any authority to do so, but one thing I always say to people to do is like the best way I found, like if you want to find like art blogs or art websites to submit your work to, the easy way to do it is find an artist you really like, Google them, and reverse image search that where their work appears online, and then contact those places, and then be like, oh,
Mm.
actually. So if you search, say, I don't know, let's say you search Francis Bacon because who doesn't like Francis Bacon, and look at where his work is appearing online in terms of like who's written interviews about him or with him or transcripts. Or actually, let's choose somebody contemporary. Let's say Mark Ryden. Let's say I don't know if you know his work, but let's say Mark Ryden, contemporary artist painting nowadays. I'll send you his work later. Painting nowadays. Only because I mentioned him in an interview a few days ago, and I was like, he's in my mind. Um, it's like pop surrealism, which is really interesting. A whole like complete genre. Um, so someone like Mark Ryden, you like his work. You do pop surrealism. Say you'll Google his work. Look at everywhere his work is currently being shown in terms of like websites and blogs and interviews, and then just contact those people and be like, oh, hey, I'm an artist. I was really, I read your work, your interview with Mark Ryden. I really loved it. Wondering if you'd be interested in interviewing me or possibly get interviewed. That's probably the best way to do it. Makes the most sense that I've found. But yeah, that's my advice to people if they want to find out places to actually share their work beyond social media, because I think that's also a key. I think social media is great, but it only gets you so far because it's not, as you said earlier, like you're not always just going to get discovered by sharing on social media. I think particularly if your reach A isn't that big, or B, if people aren't just seeing your post because they just don't see it nowadays. I think you have to have influence outside of social media, particularly Instagram, for people to really kind of like, be drawn to your work. Like, places like My Modern Metropolis and boom.com. And I actually have, I wish I'll send you at some point if you want. I've got a list of places that I found years ago that I just like a list of places to submit your work to. I'll send it to you if you like.
Oh,
Um,
cool. Yeah, I would love to see that.
I posted it ages ago. It's on my Instagram somewhere. It's floating around somewhere in one of the highlights, I think. But I always love sending to people because it's like this is a list of places that I can say they're good places to submit your work to. Because I used to back in the day, I used to like scour through art blogs and art sites when I was younger, when I was at school. Hence me creating my own and having a podcast. So yeah, I'll send you a list basically of places to submit your work
Yeah,
to.
I would love that.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I got completely off topic to whatever we're talking about. So
No, no,
my
it's
apologies.
good.
So at what point did you feel comfortable calling yourself an artist?
Oh, yeah, this is a really good question. I think a lot of people struggle with this, myself included. I don't think that I started calling myself an artist until a year or two ago, and I think it
Wow.
had a lot to do with figuring out the sort of paintings that I wanted to make and then making them,
Mm,
which was a sort of 10-year process of like I had these images that I wanted to make and I didn't have the vocabulary, the visual vocabulary to produce them. Um, and then I went to school and learned how to paint and then sort of lost my ideas and my voice a little bit after school, and then had to circle back to what I really wanted to make. And then finally, in the last 2 years, I've started making the work that I really want to make. And now I feel like I can call myself an artist. But it's still, yeah, it's a weighty word, and I feel like it's sort of a sacred trade, and I think that's why it took me so long to really want to use that word. I don't think it's a term to be used lightly.
So what makes somebody an artist?
Oh, okay, so my teacher in school, Alciclus, he would say he had this quote hanging on the wall, and it was like, uh, a person who works with his hands is a laborer. A person who works with his hands and his mind is a craftsman. And a person who works with his head and his hands and his heart is an artist.
Okay,
So
I like
there's
that.
like this emotional piece where you're creating things, I think, from somewhere inside of you. And there's a vulnerability there. Yeah, but I think it's an ambiguous term, and it has become an ambiguous term. Um, because I think if you had asked, what is a painter, if you had asked that 600, 700, 800 years ago, I mean, like a painter was a very clear and definite profession where you had to produce representational work. Like if
Mm,
you wanted to, if you're a wealthy merchant and you want to purchase land in a foreign country, you would hire a painter to go survey the land and paint it and bring you back the paintings and show you what the land looked like,
mm,
right? And you had to then, as that painter, make a painting that looked exactly like the land that this merchant was going to buy. So like at that point it's a very concrete term, and there's a very concrete um level of competence that you have to reach and a very specific set of tools that you have to learn. And I think today it's a lot more um open for people, and there's a lot more opportunity for people to be personally involved in what they make. So I think it's gone from sort of a trade that was necessary to, post invention of the camera, it's become, sort of whatever anybody wants to make it for themselves, which is really cool.
That's a really interesting way to put it because I always ask people, and the question that will come up later, like very much later in the conversation, is like, can anybody be an artist? But I never also ask people like, so what makes somebody an artist? Because I feel like because people like to make a distinction between people who create and then people who are artists, because I feel like they're not always the same. But it's always trying to make that distinction is quite hard because like there's no such pure definition. It's all very like loose. So are you a full-time artist?
Um, almost. I have like a
Oh,
few side gigs.
no. So
uh,
that's I think that's really personally, and I feel like I said this in every single episode. You probably heard it a few times, but I think that's probably the best place to be because I feel like, and I feel like I'm just literally repeating myself every single episode. But for me, I feel like there's nothing wrong with being a part-time artist. I feel like being a full-time artist, and I say this all the time, is not for everybody. I feel like sometimes it does not work out. Sometimes you just do not have the skills, you do not have the time, you do not have the longevity. You just don't have the means to be able to be a full-time artist. I think it's not for everybody. It's the dream for everybody because who doesn't want to I say just wake up and paint and go to sleep if that's it. But but who doesn't want to just kind of, have a life where they're constantly creating? Who doesn't want that? But at the same time, it's like that's not always valid for everybody. It's so easy to look at artists who have what seems to be like the perfect career, only to find out like, oh, actually, they have a partner that actually pays for everything, or they have a scholarship that enables them to have a certain amount of money, or they have rich parents, or they're in a like financially comfortable position from like 30 years of working that allows them to be able to create this work. And it's so illusionary sometimes. You can look at people and be like, all they're doing is producing all this amazing work. They have, you know, months and months at a time to be able to just sit around and create. And it's like, I want that. But then you realize you can't have that because that's not your life. So I feel like the fact you're like on the cusp of becoming a full-time artist is actually really exciting because I feel like with your work, absolutely. Could you do that? Absolutely. There's a few artist friends that I have that I'm going to definitely send your way who are full-time artists. And I feel like you could benefit by talking to them. However,
oh, cool.
I also do think that just this idea that you are busy working, yet you're also prepared to spend your time on something that you are passionate about, that will change as soon as that becomes your full-time job. Like things change when money is involved. So it's always
Yeah.
like I always say to people, as if I have any authority, but I'm always like, be careful because you love what you do now, but will you be loving it in a year's time when 90% of your day is admin and 10% is working on a piece of work? It's a very different experience doing that full time. And I know a few artists here and there who are very stressed. They're great artists, they're amazing people, they're so lovely, but they're constantly stressed because it's always about I need to pay my rent, I need money to eat, I need to, have the right finances. And yeah, I think being a full-time artist isn't for everybody, but I feel like if it's something you want to do, absolutely go for it. But it's just mind how you go, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. I think and I was thinking about this the other day, and I thought, you know, if I got to a place of being financially capable of being full time, I don't know that I would necessarily drop my
Hmm.
side gigs
Hmm.
because one, it's nice to get out of the studio and like do something
Yes.
else.
Yes.
And that's sort of like a creative reset where it's like, when you're not looking or thinking about it, it comes to you a little bit.
Yes.
And then there's the other aspect of like being more conscientious with your time when you know that you have something to do at say 4 p.m. and you're in the studio in the morning and you're like, okay, I have to get these things done. I can't just, be here till midnight.
Yeah.
Like, so I think there's a lot of advantages to being a part-time artist, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's this dream, like you said, of waking up and creating, but it's not that simple.
Yeah.
Like it sounds really romantic, but like
Yeah.
most things, it's not all like fun and games. It's really
No.
difficult. So, yeah.
Yeah. It's like I'm very fortunate to get to talk to a lot of people and I see a lot of people's careers. And like of all the people I've spoken to on the podcast, especially, like it's interesting to kind of dig a little bit beneath the surface and understand like actually how they are operating in terms of like Are they enjoying being a full-time artist? Are they even a full-time artist? They might appear to be, but they're actually not, that kind of thing. Like, it's always
Yeah.
interesting for me to kind of understand like how people are actually working and how people actually manage the workload of being an artist. Because as you said, it's a lot of work. You don't think it is, but it's more work than you think it's going to be. This is the
Yeah.
thing. Like, it's not just painting, waking up and painting and going to sleep, if only. Although
Right.
it is if you can pay other people to do everything else for you. So there's
Yeah.
also that. And something else I was talking to actually a good friend of mine about today as well. Because all I do in my days is just talk to artists, clearly, which is actually not untrue. All my friends are artists, which is the best thing ever. But I was saying to her from our conversation yesterday um, that you have to just sit down and make a plan, like figure out what you want. Because I think the problem is that a lot of artists go into being an artist without knowing what they want from it, or without knowing kind of like just having some kind of plan. It doesn't have to be concrete. You don't have to have a business plan necessarily, but having kind of like goals you want to hit and targets you want to meet, and like how you're gonna, if you're not good at social media, how you're gonna get better. Just kind of stuff like that. I think it's really important to sit down with yourself and to analyze what you want versus what you think you want. Because I feel like it's very easy to get caught up in somebody else's dream and be like, well, I want to be like them. I don't know, but you won't be because you're not. I don't know. It's
Yeah.
some,
Yeah. And there's just so many different ways to be successful as an artist. And
yeah.
there's so many, you could sell your art to interior designers and
Mm.
like get really successful at that. Or you could focus on like getting press coverage, or you could get good at social media, or, there's just like hundreds of avenues that you could go down. And yeah, I think you make a good point. Like you have to choose a few things and then just go after those, because otherwise you're just kind of like floating in a nebulous cloud. And yeah, you can't chase all of those possible
Mm.
realities at the same time.
Yeah, as much as you want to, because you also want to try and evolve and change and try different things. And you
Yeah.
need to leave. The thing is that you need to leave yourself room to be able to experiment and to try new things and to be comfortable with what you're creating, but also produce something consistent. I think that's really the biggest challenge for an artist is to be both consistent and experimental at the same time. It's kind of quite hard. Not a lot of people have mastered that, I don't think, particularly well. Let's talk about your work. So, can you please describe your work for those who may not have seen it?
Yeah. So I am a contemporary figure painter. Um, and more specifically, I do painted collages, which means I layer scenes over one another. So often I'll go out and paint a landscape, and then I'll go into the studio and layer in a figure. Um, and I try to do this in a really subtle way so that the final result looks like a coherent scene, like one scene, when in fact it's two, three, four, five scenes put over one another. Um, and this produces a sort of dreamlike, vague displacement.
Hmm.
And that's the sort of work that I'm making now.
I absolutely adore your work. It's exactly the kind of work
Thank
I
you.
love. Like, it's really the kind of like I love. And I interviewed somebody fairly similar-ish to the point that I was a bit like, should I be doing this interview? Because it's quite similar. But I'm also like, no, because I like to see how different you actually are to other people. Just because your work may be similar doesn't mean it's the same. Something I've also learned. But it's interesting to me because it's the work I absolutely adore. This idea of mystery, intrigue, people, landscapes, a mixture of both. You don't quite know what you're looking at. You're not too sure if it's real, if it's not real. I love that
Yeah.
kind of work because it gives me such a chance to be able to be part of the work, which is why I love that kind of work. And I think that's what's really, to me, really interests me. But just as a general, before I get into kind of my own thoughts about the work, or at least here and there, like, are there any particular themes and questions that you are exploring within the work itself?
I'm really interested in dreams and memory, and how, like, I think that people are largely ruled by their by frankly their memories, because all you know of your life is what you remember happening.
Hmm.
And at the same time, memory is kind of this murky, sort of inaccurate recollection of what happened.
Hmm.
Like my memories are always really fragmented. Like I'll remember, how a table or a doorway looked somewhere, but I won't remember at all where it was or like
Hmm.
who was with me. But I'll remember really liking, that doorway. And I just think it's really interesting that, your understanding of your life is based off of something that is so sort of rickety and unpredictable. And I mean, more broadly, I'm really interested in, yeah, a sense of mystery. And I think that, when you say everything in a painting, you kind of kill it.
Hmm.
Um, a lot of that is how I was taught, the school that I went to. But we were taught, don't paint like a photograph, paint like how you see. Because the human eye sees through layers and layers of understanding and memory and your lineage, like your family tree and history and all of these things. And a camera is kind of it's a different tool. And you can produce really beautiful work with a camera, but it's not the same. It doesn't see like how the human eye sees, so you shouldn't
Hmm.
paint, how a photo looks. So so in that sense, yeah, trying to maintain a sense of mystery and not saying everything in a painting. And I kind of think of mystery as sort of a doorway into the viewer's sort of desires and secrets and their own memories. And so I think if you paint with this understanding that you're intentionally leaving certain things out, then you in turn make work that leaves room for the viewer to kind of lose themselves there. And I think, everybody, myself included, we all, in order to live in civilized society, you have to bury certain things and you have to, present a certain front in order to be successful. And I think that art is one of the places where we are really encouraged to get in touch with those things. It's like
Hmm.
probably the only place, unless you're talking about intimate relationships, but a lot of life is about work and putting food on the table and just trying to survive. And like art is kind of this sacred place where people can go and just kind of sit and enjoy something. And so I try to keep that in mind when I'm painting. I try to keep the viewer in mind and leave room for them.
That's such an interesting way to put it. I think that's such an interesting way to put it because, like, you're right. Art enables people to dive into the deeper parts of themselves, to kind of understand themselves, to kind of it allows people to self-reflect in a way that a lot of other mediums don't necessarily, because like you're applying yourself and your time. Like every single piece of your work is a document of your time spent on it. It's your history. It becomes part of you, whether you think about that way or not. Like that's interesting actually to think of it that way. Do you think there are any themes that art can't explore?
Um, no, I don't. Um, because I think art is a window into yourself, and the self is infinite. So even if an artist isn't aiming to explore a certain theme, you can spontaneously bring that up inside of someone else, and so that you have sort of
Yeah.
explored that in a sense. So I think, yeah, I think the possibilities are really endless.
Yeah, and also I think because you're never fully in control, well, you're never in control of what people feel about your work or how your work is perceived by others. That people may find themes in your work that you didn't even think about, or that you're not even registering, because the whole point is that. And the great thing about art, personally, the great thing about art, not personally, the great thing about art is that it's personal. Like people relate to it on a level very differently to say the same with music. People relate to it on a very different level than they would with just the world of world. It becomes more about the psyche and the mind and about thoughts and feelings and kind of like, as I always say, it's it's the externalization of the internal, you know. I think that's really helpful for people just to, for both the artist as the person creating it, but also as people viewing it, being able to have a space in which they can share their thoughts and emotions and opinions and kind of fears and frustrations through looking at art as well. I think looking at art is also just as powerful as creating it, or there is definitely like a dynamic there.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So I thought, oh, I was just like, all right, a little bit about your work, nothing crazy. But I put so like so just as like notes for her, and I feel like I read people's notes as if like they're essays and they're not. So I put like
Yeah.
dreamlike, liminal, and elusive. I put paintings that are as foggy as the memories they portray. The work invokes a sense of displacement because I think for me, like that's exactly what your work feels like. It feels like I feel like I said this the last episode with somebody else's work, but it's kind of true. It's a work I kind of gravitate towards. So that's why I'm very aware that when I see an artist, I love their work. I'm like, I really want to talk to this person. There's a reason that all these artists are quite similar. Cause I'm like, this is the work I gravitate towards too. But it's like I love the fact that it's just so it seems so bizarre, but there's a reason for things. Like it might seem like, oh, this makes no sense, but there's a purpose for everything. And I love that. It's like it's almost like a finely crafted world that I'm looking at. Like, and you have these characters who play certain roles in certain places and certain scenarios that to me might seem very odd and strange, but to you it makes sense. Like, and I'm kind of curious, like, is your work autobiographical?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's autobiographical in the sense that the subject matter comes from my immediate surroundings, like the landscape and, my friends or people that I see out and about that I just happen to take a picture of. But I'm not necessarily, it's not autobiographical in the sense of trying to tell my own story. And I think there's a sort of disconnect with like kind of what people perceive art to be and what it is or what the artist is trying to do. Like usually what I'm doing is like working with shapes
Hmm.
and like a painting to me is always just about an arrangement of shapes. So, I'll paint one layer or one scene and then I'll kind of go through my mental Rolodex of things that I want to paint, and I'll find something that works with that composition. And then it's kind of like a puzzle, and then I just continue to layer things into the scene until it clicks. And then once it clicks, it's done. And so it's autobiographical in the sense that all those elements that I'm working with are from my environment, but I'm not necessarily trying to tell a story. I'm trying to paint a, a painting that works, visually.
See, that's interesting because I feel like storytelling probably does play, for me at least, like a central role in your work. I feel like there is a sense of like there is a story there. It's almost like the work is a puzzle for the viewer to figure out.
Yeah.
Like there are elements because like I've always kind of wondered, and is this a premature question? It's probably a premature question, but I've always wondered about like the characters in your work in terms of like who are they?
Yeah, they're just like people. I think they're just everyday people, my friends, like hanging out and having a smoke, or somebody hanging out outside of a bar, or someone in the middle of a, a good conversation, or having a beer. I think that there's a lot of beauty in the everyday, so I'm really drawn to like little intimate everyday scenes. And I think there's so much to be taken and like understood and seen from those little moments. Like it doesn't have to be really grand, like you can just
Hmm.
see someone talking on their telephone or something, and there's like so much in the way they stand and their posture. And so yeah, I think the characters are just they're just people. They're just the people that I'm surrounded with in my life that I love and I take pictures of.
But I found that really interesting you would say that because the way you paint them, they almost become renderings of people. They're not actually like perfectly fleshed out. They're like these kind of almost like ghostly imprints of people,
Yeah.
which is what I find interesting because like you could very much question like, are you looking at a person? Are you looking at like the memory of a person or the form of a person or like the impression of a person? which is what I love about the work, because the work is very ambiguous and it's very like, is it, isn't it? I like that.
Yeah, I like the idea also of like hidden figures, or how you can drop something in the dead center of a canvas and it's the
Mm.
last thing that someone sees.
Mm.
And I think that that's really interesting. And I think painters are always, you're always kind of looking to like hold the viewer's attention. And so I think that, yeah, hiding things or like making little mysteries or like leaving a secret in the painting is a really good way to like to hold people's attention and kind of inspire their own, experience with the art.
It's kind of interesting because I feel like your work, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I feel like your work almost has like a slightly sinister edge.
Yeah, it does.
It kind of seems like not dark in the way of like, oh, it's really dark, but it kind of has like this weird, kind of like eerie, sinister edge. Because you said about, people drinking, people, hanging out at bars and talking on the telephone, but it's like jovial activities, but with a sinister edge. They're every day, but kind of transformed into these kind of slightly nightmarish, very kind of almost kind of like bizarre states. They're almost like, rather than being like scenes, they're almost like states. They're almost like a state of mind. You're looking at the scene through like somebody who is like drunk, maybe, or somebody who is like half asleep, or, I don't know, like this idea.
Yes.
Obviously, you have an image called, I should have wrote it down because and I didn't. Sedated Girl Summer. And it's like the idea of like being sedated or kind of being almost in this kind of trance-like state or not really knowing where you are. Like, I don't know if that's intentional on your part, but it kind of gives me the kind of vibe of like, I would kind of question like whose eyes are we exactly looking through in your work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't know that I have the answer.
Hmm.
And yeah, it definitely is like sinister and dark, but in like a subtle way. People say
Yeah.
that a lot. Um, and it's like I don't go into it being like, oh, I'm gonna make this creepy thing, but
Hmm.
then like I finish it and it's like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, that's good. Yeah, I don't know. I think it might be because there's like maybe something inherently sinister or foreboding about being displaced
Hmm.
in general, like people don't like to feel like they don't know where they are.
Yes.
And in that
Yes.
way, there's something scary about dreams, because you don't really know where you are or what's going to happen. And like I think that sense of loss of control just breeds a sense
Yes.
of like unease, like uncertainty, because it's uncharted territory. So that might be a part of it. And I think maybe another part of why the work is sinister is because I really like to work with darks. Like I really love
Hmm.
like a really dark, dim scene.
Hmm.
And I don't always paint them, but nighttime displacement are two things that are probably pretty unsettling for like everyone. So
Yeah, absolutely. Like, absolutely. Like, I really, really, really agree with that. I think it's so, like, the idea of like loss of control. That's such an interesting way to kind of consider, like, an interesting lens to look at your work, though. Because it's so true. Like, the sense of displacement of like, you don't know what you're looking at or who you're meant to be whilst you're looking at these scenes or like who anybody else is for that matter, because no one
yeah.
really looks quite right. And actually, yeah, I'll ask you this now, actually. So, one thing I'm very curious of in any artist's work, especially people like yourself, is that like artistic reality. I'm always kind of interested in the idea of like, what kind of reality are you trying to portray through your work?
What kind of reality? I think the reality of well, okay, so a reality is an interesting word because it's like our dreams and memories a reality, but I
Hmm.
mean internally they are, I think, for everyone. So I think I'm trying to depict, yeah, sort of a dreamlike state. And again, sort of depicting that as an attempt to like allow the viewer to connect with what's inside of them. And I don't think that I'm trying to depict the same world in every painting. Like I don't think
Hmm.
that all my paintings are from the same world, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
Um, I like to reuse certain elements or like I'll reuse my drawings in paintings. Like I'll put the same figure in another painting. But it doesn't mean that there's necessarily a through line. And I think
yeah,
that's part of the ambiguity of it is just creating this sort of destabilized reality that we all have inside.
Yeah, okay, that was actually gonna be like one of my next questions, the idea of like a through line through the work or like recurring characters or the idea of like do they all coexist together? But I think because I think the idea of like because the way you paint is really interesting, which really what draws me is that it's not realistic, but it's also not so abstract that you don't know what it is. It kind of sits in like I there's an interview I did with the artist with Mark Thompson, and he called it the netherworld between the real and the abstract. And I feel like your
Yeah.
work sits in there perfectly. It's a kind of work I absolutely adore. I have so many artists to send you that do similar kind of work, which is like it's very bizarre because it's like it's real, but it's also completely not real at the same time. But it's not surrealism, but it's also not abstract. It's kind of like this weird, interesting middle ground between like things that make sense, but they don't make any sense. And I love that.
Yeah.
So yeah, like and your work kind of fits into this kind of like netherworld where it's like we recognize the places and we recognize the people, but we also have no idea who they are. It's strangely familiar, but not in a way that we know. It's weird. It's really interesting. I just absolutely adore it. I think it's so fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah, I think yeah, that makes a lot of sense, this like netherworld concept. I think I grew up kind of looking at the major surrealist
Hmm.
painters like Dali and
Yeah.
Magritte and all those guys,
Yes.
and they sort of they build these really weird scenarios that like wouldn't happen, like a toy train coming out of a wall. Like Magritte
Yeah.
has a painting like that, and it's like, it's or they build, like Dali will build these like really insane dreamscapes that are like not founded in reality at all. Um, but then they have these other works that sit in that field that you were just talking about. Like Magritte has this painting of it's a landscape, and it's really just a view of a little clearing of trees, and you're kind of looking at it from afar, and there's a blue sky. And I remember my art teacher putting this up, and he said, "Well, so what's the deal with this painting? Like, why is this surreal?" And we all looked at it and we couldn't answer it. And the answer is that the trees are painted in a nighttime scene. So like they're
Mm.
really dark, and then there's this little orange like lantern glowing. But above the trees there's this bright blue sky. And it's like this is why it's sort of like it is surreal, because those two things don't go together, but because it's so subtly done, it makes you want to come back to it and look at it again. And so I think that what I'm interested in is not necessarily like pure surrealism, like you said, but more how minutely do you have to move the dial of reality to make it a little off?
Mm.
Like if I can move reality 1 degree to the left, like what does that produce? Rather than just like building this entirely new like alien world that like
Mm.
has nothing to do with Earth or people. Like I'm interested in that little spot in between where it's like it is reality but it's not. And like how to what like what's the tiniest degree that I can like shift things to make it a little off.
Mm. Yeah, like that's the thing. I absolutely love that. I think it's, and also like that image by McCree is such a good image as well. By the way, it's just such a good image. It's a really interesting concept where like you can't quite tell what's wrong with it, but you know something's wrong with it. It's almost like this weird kind of like subtle like as you said earlier, like unease. Like you're looking at it and you're feeling a bit uneasy because you're a bit like I can't figure out what's up with this. And then when you see it,
Yeah.
you're like, how did I not see that?
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's like so obvious but it's not.
yeah. So it's interesting because as you said earlier, like you mix kind of like plein air painting with then using photographs later on. Like how did that method of working come about?
Um yeah. Well, so the way that I was trained in school was like classical formal training. So like we were always painting from life. Nothing was ever from a photo. And that went for, figure training. It was true for still lives and it was true for landscapes. Um, and I was really, really fortunate to have that really solid basis of education. Um, so because of that, after I graduated the school, I spent a few years just doing plein air, because I love landscapes and I was only painting them from life. And I was kind of
Um,
living in my car and traveling around the country and like my easel was in my car, and so the only place that I had to set up was really outside. And
Yeah.
so I made this like series of, paintings outside and across the country. So that was really like solidly how I painted for like 3 or 4 years. And then in 2021, I went on this trip by myself to the desert and I painted the kind of the canyon where I was staying. It was in the desert in Utah, and there were these weird, kind of creepy, like tall red cliffs. The desert in Utah, if you ever get to go, you should go to Utah
It's
because it's like absolutely insane.
Utah's like on my
It's like
list of the place.
it's like being underwater except you're on land. It's really weird.
Interesting explanation. That's such an interesting description.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
Um, so I painted that scene and then I came home and I had, I'm always keeping mental note of little things that I like that I want to paint later on, like the awning in my neighbor's yard, or like the grocery store, the little corner where they sell like the firewood, like this is already kind of a fragmentary way of thinking, but like I always have this stock of images that I want to paint. And so I came home and I don't know why I did it, but I painted the local railroad in my town, which is it's like an abandoned train
Wow.
and it's a museum. But so I painted that sort of abandoned train and I put it in front of the canyon that I had painted. I put it just like right into the painting and I painted it from life. I just set up that same painting of the canyon in front of the train and painted the train into it.
Wow.
And then I put this little light in the window, like as if the window of the train, as if the sky was coming through it, but the canyon was behind it. And so it has this weird kind of like surreal, displaced feeling to it. And that one actually ended up getting into like Southwest Art, the 21
Wow.
under 31 that they do, 21 artists to collect now. So that was super lucky and like cool that that ended up happening. But that was the first painting that I did where I layered scenes over each other. And then I think that that moment sort of coincided with my feeling like, okay, now I can maybe start to like really work from photo references. Like maybe I've worked from life long enough that I'm okay with working from photos because
Mm.
like I understand visually what's happening with a camera a little bit better. Where I can like sort of detect how reality would actually look and like make that difference in my painting. I try to do that. It's very hard.
Mm.
Um, but yeah, those two moments kind of happened at the same time. And then it was winter and I couldn't go outside. So I was just in my studio and I just started messing around with like layering photo images over each other. And that's kind of how that whole thing started.
So the thing that I find really interesting about that and about you is that that's quite a big skill to have because you can paint from life, you can paint from photographs, you can paint portraits, and you can paint landscapes all very well. And I think that's actually quite a lot of skill because at the end of the day, like you see some artists who are only good at one of those four things, or maybe like two of those four things, not everything. That's actually really interesting, actually, because it's like, yeah, because you don't just layer like landscapes together, you layer people and landscapes. Like that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think it's because I was lucky enough to go to the Academy of Fine Arts in New Orleans, and the founder there, he was always saying, like back in my day,
Yeah.
you had to be able to paint landscapes and figures and still lifes. And now everybody asks, well, what kind of painter are you? Are you a landscape artist
Mm.
or a figurative artist or a still life artist? And it's like, well, you should really have all of those. You should really have all of those skills. And I think I was lucky enough to learn with like really, really solid artists at that school, who were like kind of at the top of their craft in terms of what they, whether they were teaching portrait or figures or still life. And it's sort of really sad that this is the direction that painters are being sort of pigeonholed into of like picking one.
Mm.
Um, because I feel like learning how to paint is kind of like learning a language. So to me, it's like if you only are taught how to paint a landscape, it's like learning Spanish without learning how to conjugate any of the verbs.
Yeah.
Like you're missing this whole really important aspect of the visual field. Like I think if you're going to learn to paint, it's really wonderful to learn how to like it's what you're really learning is the capacity to paint something that's in front of you. And like ideally someone that comes out of like an atelier study program, you can give them a canvas and give them three colors. Like you really only need the primaries and you can make any color in black and white. And you put an object in front of them, like it can be a basketball or it can be a tree, and they paint it how it looks. And like
Mm.
that's you should really come out of school with that skill set of like whatever somebody puts in front of you, you can paint. Um, I don't know that I'm really there, but I think that the school that I went to, like that was their philosophy, and I think that that's really beautiful because then you learn the language and then you can say whatever you want. You can say any sentence you want, like metaphorically. If you're going to learn a
Yeah.
language, you should learn to say anything. Uh, and that's really what being fluent is. So I think, yeah, it's worthwhile to like learn all the things.
Yeah. That's actually a really good point because I think the problem is also because like in your career, you're kind of always pigeonholed into choosing one thing or like being like a certain kind of painter, or people just are afraid to fail and to be bad at something. If you're a really amazing landscape painter and you paint them really, really well, and you want to paint portraits, but you're terrible at painting portraits, that's absolutely fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. You're not going to be great at everything. But I think a lot of people are just quite scared to fail, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. I think failing is a really big part of uh being an artist, like making bad art for like years and
Yeah.
years and years and years. Like, and then getting kind of good, and then still half of the stuff you make you're not really happy with. Like, that's something that you just kind of have to like live with. Um, and I mean, I think there's an aspect of like you can teach yourself a lot too.
Hmm.
Um, like I still feel very shaky with figures, so it's interesting that you said that they sort of all seem at the same level of competency. Like that's really exciting because I feel like painting figures is really, 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 really hard. And
Hmm.
like I've started studying, like I have this like coffee table book by Bouguereau. He's like an old 19th century painter. Really, really good figure painter. Like you look at his paintings and you feel like you're sitting in front of the person.
Hmm.
Uh and what I started to do in the last few weeks was like I bring the book into the studio, and then when I'm painting a figure, I try to find one of his paintings where the light is kind of similar to the figure that I'm painting. And then I just
Hmm.
literally mix the color on my palette of like the cheekbone of the figure in Bouguereau's painting, and then I like drop it onto the actual paper. Like I put the brushstroke onto the painting as it's printed in the book, and then
Wow.
I wipe it off and I do it again and again and again until it matches. And then once it
Yeah.
matches, I put it on my painting on the figure's cheekbone,
Wow.
and then I just like slowly move in that direction. Um, so anyway, there's a good bit of like self-teaching I think that you can do, and I don't know. But yeah, it is a lot about being bad at something for a long time. I think for a long time I was really bad at figures and now I'm like sort of okay. But yeah, it's a lot of trial and error.
But the things that you're willing to progress and you're willing to try, and I think that's half the battle. Is willing to be able to put the time in and be like, I'm not going to be good at this straight away. It's not going to be perfect. Because I think, as we said earlier, like you can peak too soon. Like I have a very good artist friend, and she's incredible at what she does. Absolutely incredible what she does, and she is one of these artists who she's very like a natural at art. She'll create these beautifully detailed paintings that people absolutely adore, and she has like a lot of followers. And that she's kind of like quote unquote a success story. But where'd you go from that? Because if people are looking at your work straight out of the bat, being like, this is the best thing ever, where'd you go from that? It's kind of hard to figure out, like, you don't know yourself as an artist yet because you've only just started within, say, the last 2 years. And people are loving your work so much that it's like you've boxed yourself in before you've even had time to know who you are. It's kind of like I feel like every artist needs at least like 5 years of just creating work, whether people see it or not,
Yeah.
to understand who they are. Because I think the problem is that this is definitely very premature, but we have so much pressure from social media to always be constantly doing something that people are always watching what you're doing, when it's like sometimes you just need to create without people ever seeing it, just so you develop skills, just so you develop your own tastes and opinions about your own work. I think that's the problem we have, is that we're always, not always, but I think a lot of the times we think about other people before you think about yourself in terms of when you're creating work.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. And that reminds me, like, there's this quote, and I can't remember who said it, but it's essentially that, like, your taste is what moves you forward,
Mm,
like, and
yeah,
keeps you, like, continuing to make work. So if you have good taste and you're making art that doesn't live up to that, you keep moving forward, and, like, just because you're not satisfied with what you're making now, that's really just because you have good taste, and you just have to keep, like, making what you consider to be bad art until you get to where
yeah,
hopefully you get to where you're making what you consider good art. That's a whole other situation, but yeah, like, I think there's a lot to be said for that, and the nice thing with painting too is that it's never permanent, like, you can always go over something. Like,
mm,
I think about the sculptors, and it's like, "My god," like, you can't mess it up, you know, like,
hmm,
I mean, I
yeah,
guess you could put the clay back on, but, like, it just is such a different way of thinking, but
yeah,
that's a different conversation, but, yeah, you can always go over a painting, you can always start again, you can always fix something, and that's really cool, because life isn't like that. Like,
yes.
you can't go back and fix anything. So,
No, they definitely can't. So, what does a painting do that a photograph doesn't?
a photograph is something that's taken through a lens, and an eye is a much more complex contraption that sees through, like I was saying earlier, all these layers of emotion and history and memory and opinion and emotion, and they're all sort of rolled into one. And in that sense, each eye is different from each other eye, whereas a camera lens is singular and sort of sterile. So even if you were going to photograph, like, say, a glass of water, and the glass of water is in focus and the rest of it is blurred, that's maybe as close as you could get to photographing something in the same way that an eye sees something.
Mm,
But really, it's not the same at all. You know, I can look at a glass of water in front of me and not be paying any attention to anything else around me, but it's not gonna look the same. And also I'm thinking while I'm looking at the
mm,
glass, and, maybe I notice something in my periphery, and that triggers some kind of memory, and I have all these associations with the glass of water, and it's just not the same. From an emotional standpoint, and also from a very concrete sort of visual standpoint, because what a camera does is, it sort of compresses the value scale. So, like, if you think of a value scale as from black to white, like pure black to pure white, pure dark to pure light, and then you have all these grays in between, the camera is never really, capturing exactly how dark your darkest shape
yeah.
is and how light the lightest shape is. And so in that sense, just from a purely visual standpoint, if you're gonna copy a photo to the T as a painter, your value scale is gonna be wrong. And I think that that's why painting directly from photos doesn't really work, um, unless you can kind of get a sense of what the photo is depicting, and stand in front of it and sort of like try to remember the value scale and the color scale before you take the photo and before you go in the studio and paint it. Um, but yeah, they're really just not the same thing. The camera's a very convenient tool, and I'm very grateful to have it. Um, because it has allowed me to like be able to paint things that I never could have painted if I had to paint them from life, like interesting little snapshots of people doing things that you can't necessarily ask a model to pose. So in that sense, it's really, really great. Um, but it's really not the same as painting from life, and it doesn't capture things the way the human eye does.
Would you ever actually arrange like a photo shoot for your models or for people to model for you for your work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I have not done that, but I have friends who do it. I have really good painter friends who, Shane and Sarah Scribner, and they fly models out to their studio a lot and like create these sort of really cool scenarios and photograph them and paint them. Actually, I am going to be doing that, I think, for the first time with them in a few weeks. So
Oh,
there's this call for Fine Art Connoisseur magazine for paintings of artists painting artists. And so the three of us, like, we hang out a lot and we paint a lot together. And so we're going to do that and we're going to submit to the magazine. So that will probably be my first time, like, formally arranging a photo shoot.
hmm.
And we're gonna buy like neon glow sticks and then hang out at night and like photograph each other outside with them, and paint those and do like a little mini series of each other, like artists painting artists. But yeah, I haven't, I just don't know what I would stage. And I think the way that my work is, it helps if it's not staged, and it helps if the person doesn't really necessarily know that they're being photographed. Like, I'll be hanging out with my friends at a party, and then I'll just, like, take a picture of, because people change, you can say, "I'm gonna take a photo, act natural," but then everyone's all of a sudden, like, changing their posture.
Absolutely.
So,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes. As a
and I
as a
really
photographer, I can attest to that. Absolutely. As soon as you take your camera out, people stare at you, or they walk
yes.
away. One of the two.
Yeah,
It's always a way because as soon as you know there's a camera there, you're very conscious that there's a a different kind of presence in like the room. Like it's yeah,
totally.
like yeah, yeah. So would you say that like the adding figures to your landscape, would you say that's more intuitive then?
That it's intuitive.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I think I add figures into a landscape. One, because it's, like, a really good point of contact for people, like what we were talking about earlier, where it's like, this is the thing that's gonna, like, kinda draw people in a way. Um, Not that landscapes on their own can't draw people in, but I like to use people in that way. Um, and then it's also just a matter of, yeah, shape and color and, like, adding yeah, I don't know why I started adding figures into landscapes, actually, but I don't know, I like the idea of, like, painting the everyday and, like, painting these little moments, and so I think it just gradually once I, got, like, competent at painting landscapes, I thought, "Okay, now I can try the figure," um, but it's it's a struggle, it's very, very hard to do, and I think I was intimidated by figures for a long time, and I think that's why I painted landscapes for so long and kind of avoided the figure. Um, yeah.
It's probably why when you paint figures, they're not perfectly fleshed out. They're not perfectly realistic because you're still on your
Yeah.
journey to creating them in a way that's kind of that you find like suitable or you find I was going to say acceptable, not acceptable, that you find comfortable. So I think because
Yeah.
of that, it's like I don't want to say easier because it's not really easier, but it's more comfortable for you to paint in a style that's a lot more looser that allows you the space in which to build up the skill of creating more realistic images. because that way you don't have,
Yeah.
it's not like you have to out the gate make sure that you everything's like perfectly rendered and that it's like hyper real. That's not your work at all. And because you're giving yourself kind of that space and that permission to be loose, it gives you the opportunity to work in a way that's more comfortable to you rather than being like forcing yourself to create work that you are just not competent in creating right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think I kind of make it a little vague because I don't feel like I have the tools yet to like make it exactly rendered.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas like with landscape, I feel a lot more comfortable like putting details in if I want to in a painting, but with figures, it's a lot harder. Like I'm still building that skill up.
But I think that's also kind of weirdly a strength in your work. The fact that it's not perfect and it's not beautiful and it's not detailed and it's not like hyper real. I think that's for me personally at least. That's what draws me to it. Like I love this fact that it's just also like it's also just strange. You're like, what is this I'm looking at? It's like this
Yeah.
bizarre kind of like dreamscape where you're like, is it, as I said to somebody the other day, like is it like a misremembered dream? Is it like, for you kind of a hazy memory? Like are you like intoxicated whilst looking at this? It's kind of like it's like how are you meant to feel looking at this work, or how are you meant to feel being within this world? Like as you said earlier, like
Yeah.
it's I like that. I think the fact that that's the case, I think that's actually really nice because it gives the viewer like an entryway into the work. It's not like, oh, this is a really lovely landscape that's painted so well, and that's
Right.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm actually really curious about the balance between the figure and the landscape. Like, do you consider one of them to be more of a focal point in your work? And like, how do you figure out the composition when both figures and landscapes are involved?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm still always coming at it from a perspective of, is this going to be a good painting vis-a-vis like are the shapes fitting together and are the colors working and is it like a solid composition?
Mm,
Um, and composition is something that sort of exists outside of subject matter.
mm,
Like I remember my teacher in art school, he would ask like, you know, why make a painting or what's a good painting? And we all had these like kind of grandiose, sort of like long-winded answers. And he was like, no, like a painting is not a vehicle for like you to transmit your ideas or to like make a political statement or any of these things. Like a painting is an arrangement of shapes.
mm.
And like what it comes down to is does the arrangement of shapes please the eye? And like the subject matter is secondary. And I remember hearing that and being like, no, 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 no. Like you can transmit all these ideas with a painting, but now I kind of work in that sense of the subject matter is secondary to whether or not the shapes work. So yeah, in terms of deciding to layer figures into landscapes, I think I did that. Well, I got to where I was comfortable with landscapes, and now I'm sort of like toying with adding figures in. But it's still really just an exercise of practicing layering shapes. And if you think about it from like a really rudimentary standpoint, a landscape is horizontal and a figure is often vertical. And so
Yeah,
then sort of you have these two angles that you're like almost guaranteed to have
yeah.
when you have a landscape with a figure, and that makes the composition a little more interesting. Whereas, if you're painting like an entirely horizontal landscape, it's harder to make a complex composition with that. Um, so I kind of am coming at it from that standpoint and like building my composition off of that axis of like horizontal and vertical that comes from the landscape and the figure.
Oh, it's an interesting. I've never thought about it like that actually. That's an really interesting consideration. That's such a good consideration because it's true. Like, particularly the way in which I will hover around the image because there is people involved or because there is landscapes involved, and like the way your eye picks up on certain things and certain colors and certain moods, and just also like the use of space, like negative space and positive space and filling space and having no space, and then the landscapes themselves being like these weird, strange, empty places. So like that's kind of interesting because I think one thing that I'm always interested in, just in my own work in general, is the idea of space and how which in the way in which we utilize and kind of I guess just use space. It's really interesting actually. Um, But yeah, that's interesting actually. The idea of like axis and X and Y and the idea of like horizontal and vertical. That's actually really interesting. I'm gonna be thinking about that now for a while. 'Cause I'm like, that's such a good point, actually.
Yeah.
Because when you think about it, it is just lines. Like that's really interesting.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. So I yeah, so I want to also ask you, actually, yeah, that's it. So do you consider like the landscape to be a character in your work?
Oh, to be a character. I feel like the idea of a character is like sort of foreign. Like I don't feel like I think in terms of characters.
Hmm.
Um, but I do I feel like certain scenes evoke certain feelings
Hmm.
or moods. And in that way, I guess the landscape, if I layer the landscape in first, then it sort of determines part of the mood of the painting.
Hmm.
Like whether it's an evening scene or whether it's a daylight scene or, neon light from a bar or something like that. Like it does sort of start to dictate the feeling of the painting. So in that way, I feel like it does play a role in the mood of the overall piece at the end. Yeah.
So I put here a sense of longing and escape. Images of the open road and desolate places always give me the sense of running from and running to something. So I love this idea of like, I think it's American. I think it's Americana as well. I think that plays a large role, which I want to talk to you about in a second. But this idea of like wide open spaces, this idea of like being in the middle of nowhere and kind of like trying to figure out, are you going somewhere or are you running from something? And I kind of look at your work and it gives me the sense of like, which is why I said character a lot. Like, who are these people and why are they in this environment and why are they in such like random, strange, open spaces? Like, what kind of landscapes are you actually drawn to? And are there any of the kind of types of landscapes that you want to use in your work in the future?
I think yeah, there is a lot of that is also being in really rural places because I was working on farms.
Mm,
And
mm,
so yeah, I think there is this feeling of sort of displacement there, and like um not knowing where you belong
yeah,
also.
yeah, yeah,
Um
yeah.
my parents are immigrants and they immigrated to the US from the Netherlands when I was a baby.
Wow, wow,
So I like yeah, grew up in the US with Dutch parents. And so there's this
wow,
always this
wow,
feeling of like kind of straddling these two realities and like never being fully in one. Like I still feel sort of like I'm not American, but I am, and I'm not Dutch, but I am. And like I think that's just sort of like something that I hear a lot of first generation immigrants say, especially like kids that are raised by people who just like picked themselves up out of their country and like moved somewhere else. Like you're always living in this sort of doorway and like you never feel like you're in one room or the other. And so like that probably that probably comes through. Um and then in terms of like you asked what subjects I want to be painting in the future. I mean, it's not strictly a landscape, but right now I'm
mm,
sort of interested in
mm,
churches.
mm,
Um,
mm.
because so I I I don't know, I just think churches are really interesting and I came across this really beautiful like kind of architectural drawing of a church recently and I think churches are interesting because well, I shouldn't say churches, more like cathedrals, like large scale like monuments of architecture that were built like centuries ago. It's kind of like more of a European concept than an American concept, but I think it's interesting because there are so many of them and people are like statistically leaving religion in large numbers now. And so it's kind of like what are we going to do with these like big structures if they're not going to be able to be like used for religion anymore? Um and there's just something really interesting about like the scale of like standing in a really tall, sort of like awe-inspiring cathedral that like people just built. And I think there's something really like beautiful about that scale. And then like figuring out how to fit that scale into another scene feels
Mm,
like a really
mm.
cool challenge for me.
Okay, so there's so many interesting things there, like so many interesting things. I was writing notes as you were talking, and I was like, oh. So the first thing that you said, doorways, use the idea of like feeling like you're in a doorway in the middle of two rooms. Like that's such a lovely analogy. Like it's actually why I love. It sounds really weird, but I think windows and doorways are really fascinating to me because this idea of like it's such a divide between two very distinct things. Same as like stairs. Stairs are like the limbo of two parts of a house. It's like stuff like that really fascinate me. This kind of middle meeting ground of like two very distinct separate entities or places, and kind of like what we can experience whilst we're existing in this kind of middle, almost purgatory kind of state. And that like really interests me. And like your use of the word doorway, it's such an interesting kind of analogy and reference. And I just typed here like how important is like symbology and metaphor in your work? Like is that something you're actively trying to evoke in people?
Right. That's a really interesting question. I I don't think that I'm actively trying to like put symbols into my work. But I do think that like that symbols are really important and I really admire painters who do that. Like
Hmm.
Bo Bartlett, do you know his work?
Don't think so.
He's a really famous like American painter and he does these really like archetypal compositions. Um yeah, it's Bo B-O and then Bartlett Bartlett. And his paintings are always kind of like these frozen snapshots of like Americana. And he's like really inspired by Norman Rockwell, who like
Hmm.
is kind of like one of the inventors of Americana, I feel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but they have this like really dark, also like sense of mystery, and you can tell that like what he's the objects that he's putting in the paintings, like he works with like guns a lot, like rifles, and like kind of like this sort of archetype of like the patriarchy and like the American like family when like yeah, it's just very interesting. So I admire that a lot, and I think it's really hard to do in a way that isn't like trite and like
Hmm.
forced. And I think that's why have avoided that. Sort of like putting symbols in to my paintings for the sake of like having a symbol. Um, but I think you're right, like doorways and windows and it's almost like you look at it and you're like you can't look at it without seeing the metaphor of like what it
Yeah.
stands for. And so it's like a really powerful thing to use in a painting and it's sort of intimidating. So I think that's why I've avoided like consciously doing that.
Because even stuff like churches, like obviously just for me, my personal opinion, I think churches are really interesting because they're like places of sanctuary. They're places people go to feel like a certain way, but then they can also be um quite, how do I put this without offending people? They can be quite enclosing because religion can also be
Yeah.
quite an enclosing thing. It can also become not cultish exactly, but it can become something other than what it originally was. And like, I don't know, I think just this idea of like, I mean, you don't have to, and I think also you don't really have a say as well as an artist creating work. Because again, going back to what I said earlier, you can't control how people are going to view your work. But I feel like it's always interesting to kind of consider like the metaphor of what you're painting, particularly somebody like yourself, because your work is so ambiguous, and you might not necessarily have the context for your work, like when people are looking at it. Because if people are looking at Instagram, they might not see. I don't know how much you necessarily write about the work itself, but they may not necessarily understand it, or they may not necessarily look at what you're writing about it. And I kind of actually, now I said that, I kind of guess like, why is it important, or is it important for you to create ambiguous work?
So are you asking about ambiguity in terms of like the actual content and subject matter of the painting or the meaning behind it?
Well, I guess both really. Just the idea of like creating work that is ambiguous generally. That kind of allows the viewer to kind of put themselves into it, but also you're not really giving anything away.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I think that I think that historically we're sort of on this trajectory of making ambiguous work.
Hmm.
like I was saying earlier, how art used to be this like really specific, and now with the invention of camera, that's no longer needed. Um, and so I feel like I'm making ambiguous work because I can, and because I spent, those years in school, like it was a very one-to-one formula. Like, okay, here's the tangerine. The tangerine is sitting on the table at 2 p.m. Paint the tangerine sitting on the table at 2 p.m. Don't mess it up.
Mm.
And it was like years of this, which was really beautiful and necessary. But I left the school and I felt kind of like I want to make something a little more interesting. Um,
Yeah.
and because of the time that I'm living in, I can. And for whatever reason, this ambiguity thing is just really interesting to me. Or, the memory dreamscape scenario is really interesting to me. Um, but I also feel like, no one makes art in a vacuum.
Mm.
And I'm on social media and my algorithm has sort of figured out, I guess, what kind of paintings I make and then presents me with similar painting or, has figured out what kind of paintings I like when I scroll through and then it feeds me similar ones. And so, despite whatever I would like to be exposed to, I'm being exposed to this increasingly narrowing visual field of images, like every other painter with a smartphone today. And because of that, I think that that has sort of moved the needle on what I want to create or think I want to create or can create. And some of that is good and some of that is not. Um, but I say all that to say, like, I think I'm making ambiguous work because that's what's being done today, and I'm an artist today. Um, it wasn't, my idea, and it wasn't really anybody else's idea. It's just kind of what's happening now. And I think it's, like, fun and interesting to participate in that. Um, and, who knows what we're gonna be doing in 500 years or whatever.
Right.
But right now, that's kind of that's the art that I'm exposed to largely is the sort of collage dreamscape work that contemporary painters are doing.
You ever heard of the Instagram account A Thousand Monkeys?
Yeah, I love that
Yeah,
account.
that's such a good account. I was going to say like your work needs to be on that account at some point because it deserves to be there. It's such a good account. It's one of my favorite accounts. That every single time they post something, I'm like, I need to figure out who this artist is and
I
message them.
know.
Because my days are literally just like every time I open Instagram, it's literally just artist research. Like it's literally all it is. It's like I need to stop. But it's like the best thing ever because it's like it's good because and also so what I like actually what you just said. It's a little bit of a tangent, but what I like what you said is that you've gotten to a point and you're comfortable with it as well, which is good, is that you know that when you open up social media, you're going to be fed something that you actually want to see. That's actually going to help you. That's actually going to mostly I hope will motivate you to keep creating the work you're creating. Because you see, oh, other people are making a career of it. Oh, actually, wait, did I add this to your list of people to look at? Sorry, by the way, I just thought of somebody's work. I was like, I need to send this to you. A guy called David
Oh, cool.
Story. Because his work is about memory, but it's almost as if like you wear glasses, you take off your glasses. He paints that, so it's all like these are really blurred.
Oh,
But they're these
cool.
but they're these images of people, and it's like I almost feel like it's like looking through an old person's eyes without their glasses, looking at like their family members or something like that. It feels like that to
Whoa.
me. David Story. Let me add him to your list here. David.
Oh,
His work is
cool.
gorgeous. Granted, it's quite similar and it's quite repetitive. But that's what I love about it. Because it's like you don't know any of this, you don't even know who these people are, but you create stories for them. It's really interesting. I've just put his name on the list. Let's talk about your creative process. So, what is your creative process like? And do you have any particular routines that help you focus on creating your work?
Hmm. Yeah, I think like one of the most important things that helps me is in the morning before I go in the studio, I get up earlier than I need to. I try to, and I just sit and read. Like I'll read a book for like half
Ooh.
an hour, and just have a cup of coffee. Part of that is because I like am just groggy in the morning and I'm not always ready to just like jump into things. Um, and I try to, yeah, I don't look at my phone for like the first hour of the day. Like I put it somewhere not in my bedroom before I go to sleep. Like I just put it somewhere in my apartment and then I don't touch it when I wake up. Like I just go about my day a little bit and like, do little things around the house and like read and have my coffee. And then when I'm ready, I go in the studio. And I find that on the days that I have to like get up and go to work, my day is like it's just different. Um, so that's like something that really helps me. Um, and then when I'm in the studio, generally I'm working on like 4 to 8 paintings at a time. Like, right now in my
Oh.
studio, I probably have, like yeah, I probably have 8 paintings that are, like, in progress, and, like, some of them I haven't touched in, like, a few months, and,
Mm.
like, the others I've worked on, in the last week. But yeah, I don't work in a linear way, like, one canvas and then, like, work on that until it's done, because usually I only have a threshold of, like, 2, 3 hours to really get, like, solid work done on a painting, and then I just start to, like, mess it up. Like, I
Mm.
just, like I don't know, I lose control, and I just start to, like, make it I just, like, ruin it. I don't know, I can't explain. Like, there's only a certain amount of time that I can work where I feel like it's productive, and then, but a day is long and you wanna get as much done as you can. So then when I can't work on that one anymore, then I just pick up whatever other painting is in the studio that's not done, that I'm, like, ready to work on. Um, and, like, yeah, some of the ones that are in my studio right now, like, I haven't worked on them in 6 months, and I'm not ready to.
Wow.
Like, I look at them and I'm like,
Mm.
mm-mm," like, I just can't, And then there's other ones where I leave it and I'm like, "It's not done, but I can't work on it right now," and I leave it for 6 months, and then after 6 months, I look at it and I'm like, "Oh, it's done." Like, it
Mm.
was done, but I just wasn't ready to, like, be done with it, which is weird, but
Yeah.
yeah. So, yeah, but I think my creative process is a lot about just, like, having a bunch of paintings going at the same time, so that I don't sort of tire myself out on one painting and then just leave the studio prematurely.
Think that idea of like knowing, like, this is I can't, like, I'm not working on this today, or being able to be like, this is not the time. I think that's actually a really interesting way of looking at working, because it's like you're very conscious of the fact that if you touch this today, you'll mess it up.
Mhm.
Or if you work on it now, you're not in the right mind state. You're not in the right place. It's not the right, as I said earlier, like, it's not the right time. It's not, it's about timing. It's not the right time. And the fact that because of that, you've set yourself up in a way where it's like, what else am I going to do? What else do I have time for? What else am I in the mood for? What else, am I going to be able to work on in a way that's going to be efficient? And I'm kind of like curious about. There was a certain thing I was going to ask you, now I've forgotten. Now I'm going to about to say it. What was I
It's
thinking of?
okay.
What was I thinking of? Because that's it. So, do ideas ever transfer from like one image to another? Like, let's say you were going to paint, I don't know, a figure smoking in a canyon landscape, but then because you aren't working on that piece today, you kind of turn to the next piece and you're like, well, actually, smoking, that's going to be like the main subject.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I I do a lot of, um like, when I have to do a detailed drawing, I do it on butcher paper, which is these, like, wide rolls of, like, paper. And then I scratch, like, charcoal on the back of them, and then I can transfer them over onto
Ah,
the canvas. But I save a lot of those drawings, and a lot of them don't end up becoming paintings, um, at the time when I draw them. But then, like, sometimes if I'm kinda stuck on a painting, I'll go through the drawings. And because they're transferable, I can just pick one up and transfer it into the painting right away. I don't have to, like, do the whole drawing again,
that's so cool.
if it's the right size. But, yeah, that sort of thing really does happen, or, like, I'll be like really fixated on like, putting a certain tree in a certain painting and then it doesn't work in that painting. And then like
Mm.
I look around the studio and I'm like, oh, it could go in that other one. So
Yeah.
that's another really nice part of like, yeah, leaving things kind of lying around the studio that I'm like visually seeing all the time, but not necessarily looking at. Um, I listened to a lot of artist interviews and there was one, I can't remember who it was, but he said, every day I go in the studio and I set up the painting that I've been working on the easel, but then I clean the studio. Like he sweeps his studio and he wipes everything down. And he says, while I'm doing that, I'm perceiving the image, but in my periphery. And then once I've done that, I can figure out what's wrong with it because I haven't actually like stared at it. Like you sort of
Mm.
like how you can only see a star if you look right next to it, but like if you look directly at the star, you can't really see it. Like, there's a lot of that sort of, like, peripheral absorption of your work if you just leave it around the studio, and then, like, over a course of weeks or months, you sort of figure out, like, what's wrong with it, and then you can work on it again.
Yeah. That's so cool. I like that a lot. I think it's interesting. It's like how some artists will hang up their work in their house. So then when they're walking through the house just doing, everyday activities, next to the fridge or whatever, they'll see it, but then they won't notice it. And then because they won't notice it, they'll figure out what's wrong with it or what they need to change. Same as some other
Totally.
artists say they hang their work upside down because it gives you a different
Yeah,
perspective of your work. And it makes you kind of observe all the things that are odd about it because if it doesn't look right upside down, then you've got to change something when you turn it around. Yeah, so that's
yeah.
really cool actually. Do you keep a sketchbook?
I do have sketchbooks, yeah. I hate drawing.
Hmm.
Like, I really drawing is, like, such a chore for me,
Hmm.
and I'm always kind of rushing through the drawing so I can get to the painting. Um So I do a lot of like rudimentary sketches, and then I get them on the canvas and then I sort of draw while I'm painting, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I do have a sketchbook, um, and I keep like a file of sort of ideas and like concepts that I want to flesh out. And um, a lot of what I do in the sketchbook is also like little color mock-ups. So like I'll draw
Mm.
little like 2 by 2 inch squares all along like a piece of sketchbook paper. Like I'll put like 8 on a sketchbook paper. And then I'll just do little arrangements of shapes and color that I really like. Um, and try to like when you draw something super small, it's easy to see kind of the flaws in the composition. Um, And so I do these little mock-ups and then I kind of go through the stock of like subject matter that I want to work with and try to fit it into those little mock-ups. And then I can like I have a little like built-in color scheme from that mock-up to like go off of. I don't know if that makes sense. It's hard to explain, but
It makes sense, but it makes me kind of wonder, like, how much of your work is like you making deliberate decisions, and how much is it to chance? Because it kind of almost seems like a sliding scale depending on the piece.
yeah, I think it's definitely like a lot of chance.
Hmm.
And because it's each piece is sort of a rotating process of
Yeah.
layering images into one another, and, like, a lot of times I'll paint a whole thing and then I'll just wipe it out. Like, I'll wipe out a whole figure or I'll wipe out a whole third of the painting, um, and or I'll just go over it. And so because it's this rotating sort of carousel of images that I'm putting in and taking out, it's really just chance when I realize or decide to be done with the painting and what you actually perceive as being the painting when
Hmm.
really there's like 8 paintings under it that like you didn't get to
Yeah.
see because I
That's so
didn't
cool.
keep them in. So like in that way it is a lot of chance.
See, that's interesting for me because it makes me feel like it's almost like your work in a strange way is like a fruit machine, like the way in which like where the I don't know what you call them exactly, but where the I guess the screens, like where the screens stop, like that's which,
Exactly.
yeah, it's kind of like, but it's like, actually, no, it's like a roulette. That's probably the best way to put it. It's almost like a roulette. Like you put ideas into not even a hat or a gun, but like a hat, and then you pick one out like this. So this canyon landscape. I don't want to keep coming back to canyons. This canyon
Yeah.
landscape with this cowboy with this leather jacket. I don't even know.
Right, right,
Trying to go for something that's not Americano, was basically being very American. Okay.
right. Yeah.
Like I should have just said like an umbrella. There you go, it's British. Perfect.
Yeah.
Like, and you're like, hey, cool. These are like three separate, completely strange, different characteristics or elements. How can I combine them in a painting that makes sense? Because I think that's the weird thing is
Yeah.
that your paintings, even though they make no sense, they make a lot of sense. Like what I'm interested in actually is the fact that your paintings are very like made by chance, but they're also very deliberate. That there's a deliberation about them. There's something deliberate about them. I think that's what interests me also because, as you said, like you class images as finished, so there has to be an end point for you.
Yeah. I think yeah, that's a really good thing to be thinking about, like chance versus deliberation. I don't I think what is deliberate about them is the mood.
Hmm. Yeah,
And then the actual like physical elements of like subject matter that I'm putting in are sort of by chance. But if I can sort of maintain the mood of the specific painting that I'm making, then it retroactively makes sense no matter what I put in because I try to like maintain the same color scheme to make it all work. Um, so I think yeah, that's overarchingly what is deliberate is like the feel of it, and then everything else is sort of secondary.
what's your favorite painting you produced?
Hmm, like ever?
Yeah,
Um,
or at least the one that feels like it's the most successful to you as an artist for what you're trying to do with your work.
I think the most successful painting I've done was in art school. It's called David in Time, and it's a still life. So we it was the assignment was we had to do this all white still life. So every you could put whatever into it that you wanted, but every object had to be white.
That's so
And then
interesting.
at the very end, yeah, it was kind of and we
Hmm.
we worked on this for months, and with a full color palette. So my objects that I picked were a bust, like a ceramic bust of the David statue, and it was like laying on its side, and then I had a blank canvas, like leaning against the wall, and I had a white like pill bottle that I had taken all the labels off of, so it's just a white like
Oh,
like a Excedrin bottle or whatever, but I took the label off, so it's just white, and then I had the white pills like scattered around, and I had a white like styrofoam cup. And then I had a white lighter, I think. I think I took the lighter out at some point. But anyway, it was this sort of like amalgamation of white objects. And it was in this still life class, and we all had a cubby, and so this still life was set up for months. And I did it on a big canvas. And like I said, we had a full color palette. So you had this was so hard. You had your white, obviously you had your primaries, you had your secondaries, and you had a black. And then for your yellow, you probably had like a cool and a warm yellow, and then you had like a
mm,
cool and a warm red. Like it was the full, full palette. And it was probably a dozen colors, and you had to paint this still life in which all the objects were white. And it
that's
was
so
really
weird.
hard. But because painting is easier when you just have like the primaries and black
Yeah.
and white, which is like what I usually work with. But this was like my teacher was challenging us to like do this. And because I had months to work on it, it came out really like realistic. Um, and yeah, I think that it's my favorite painting, um, because I think that was the point where I finally realized like, okay, I can like paint this random assortment of objects and they look exactly like how they really are.
Mm,
And that's just a really exciting moment to get to. I had a lot of help, like my teacher would come around every time and say, "You have to do this and you have to do
mm,
that." Um, but it's just a really exciting feeling to be in art school and then for a long time and then finally you make this painting and you're like, "Oh, okay, like this actually, it looks exactly like what I want to paint, but it's also in my style." And that's just sort of like a breakthrough. That painting was sort of a breakthrough point for me.
That's such an interesting concept though, because you have a full color palette, but they have to be white. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
That teaches you about a lot of different things as well. That's the thing, and also like the patience, actually, more than anything else. Because months and months and months. That's so interesting. That's
Yeah.
such a good exercise.
Yeah. Yeah. We had like a lot of really good exercises in that school. And um, I had this one teacher who, Gus Hoffman, he would say, whenever you get like a third or two-thirds of the way through a painting, you always have like your favorite corner, like your favorite spot where you're like, oh, that's so good, and I'm not gonna touch it.
Mm.
And he would be like, wipe it out, like erase it and do it again and do it better. And which is like, just
Wow.
makes you want to like scream and like throw your brushes, like,
Yeah.
because you're like, no, I love this. But like, I don't know, I think that that's a really important lesson with painting is like don't get attached to what's there. And I think
Yeah.
that like because of those exercises now I have no qualms with just like getting a rag and wiping out an entire part of a painting or a whole painting and doing it again.
Wow.
Um and then it's like even if what I put down after isn't good, I'll just erase it again and do it again,
Yeah.
like
Wow. So that's interesting. I think that's why art education is actually very important because I think sometimes you learn skills or ways of working or methods of working or practices that you're not going to be able to learn otherwise.
yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. The idea of not being precious with the work is actually quite important as well. Yeah, that's interesting. I like that. That's the idea of creating like a painting of white objects using a full color palette is bizarre. But like that's just such a weird concept, but it makes sense. That's so interesting. But actually talking about color actually, that's a nice segue. Because I want to talk to you about the color in your work. Because the color in your work gives your work a sense of like a reality. It makes everything seem a bit more lucid. So like how important is the use of color in your work? And kind of like are there any particular colors that you'd like to use?
Yeah. Color, I think I struggled with color for a long time, because I was taught from this full color palette of your primaries and your secondaries and your black and white. Um, and when you do that, you have basically like color out of the tube is really, really pure. And there are very few things in nature that you can paint that are just, for example, the red out of the tube that you wouldn't have to mix any other color into. It's very rare. So when you start with this color palette with these range of really vibrant colors, it's really hard to understand how much you have to sort of tone all those colors down to get to the reality of what's in front of you.
Mm,
And so after art school, I read something online about a painter who just worked with red and yellow and blue and black and white. Um, and essentially, if you're a really good painter, you can work with those five colors and you can produce anything
mm,
because you can figure out the ratio of, how much you have to cool a color down or how much you have to warm it up, or how dark and how light you have to make it. And you can create virtually any color with that set of colors on your palette. I'm not there, but I worked for 4 years, I think, with just those colors. And
wow.
um, it just really changed uh, my understanding of color, I think, and it made things a lot easier. Like it makes your choices a lot easier. And granted, you can switch things out, or you can have, a warm usually I'll work with a warm and a cool red, because like cad red, for example, is like a really difficult. It's very pure red, but it's really difficult to make certain purples with. So then you want a
Mm,
cool red and uh, that sort of thing. But color, like, is secondary to me to value, and I think that's something that gets taught in art school a lot is like your color doesn't really matter. What matters is how light or how dark it is. So for example, if you're going to paint a portrait, you you study like the planes of the face. So you have like if your light is coming from the front and the face is like directly facing the light, then you sort of study in school, you study anatomically, um, the planes, the physical planes of the face. So, like, the front plane of the nose is, like, bright. You know, the front plane of the forehead is bright. Your chin is then like this little square of light. And then you have like the side planes of the nose, which is a secondary plane, which is darker, you know, and then the cheeks again are bright. And then you have the like side planes of the jaw. But anyway, so if you're painting a portrait and your values and how light each plane is are correct, then when someone walks into the room from like 30 feet away and they look at this portrait, they know what it is.
Hmm.
And it doesn't matter if your skin is green or brown or white or whatever, as long as you have those values right, the portrait is going to read as a portrait from far
Hmm.
away, which is what most artists want. So that's how I was taught and that's how I work. But the colors that I like, I still generally work with a set of primaries and um, black and white. And then the two colors that I'm really interested in right now are phthalo green and alizarin crimson, which are like these really, really, really potent, like they're probably the two of the most potent colors that you can get. Um, and phthalo is kind of this like really beautiful turquoise green. And you just need a drop of it and it like completely transforms any color that you're mixing. And then alizarin crimson is sort of the same, but it's this like really fierce kind of magenta color. And so what I've been playing around with is like I work on wood now, and so I'll put a wash, like a watered down really bright color first. So like say alizarin crimson, like I'll just wash the whole wood panel with this really bright magenta. And then with wood, this really cool thing that happens, like once you let that layer dry, you can sort of dry brush other things over it, but that initial wash will come through
Hmm.
um, as this sort of like luminescent color. And that's really hard to like. I've never really been able to do that with canvas. Canvas is a lot, it's just like denser and it like soaks things up and it's harder to sort of dry brush things onto, at least for me. So that's the sort of stuff that I'm playing with now is like doing these tonal paintings, but over really potent like colors that I've washed down and then seeing what effect that sort of produces.
So how conscious are you when you're creating an image, a painting, of the colors you're using in terms of like the emotional values of colors?
I think about that a lot, yeah. Like in terms of make creating a mood, color is really important and like the color palette that you choose sort of determines the overall mood of the painting. And I think as I'm working like I try to um compress the color field if that makes sense, like so that it all feels like it's coming from the same scene. And a lot of that has to do with color, like atmosphere has a lot to do with
Hmm.
color. So if I'm painting like some trees in front of the sky and the grass, like the color of the sky is going to be in every other part of the painting too. And
Yeah.
the color of the tree is also going to be a little bit in the sky. And when you kind of make sure that all the colors, like, this is so hard to explain, but like you can paint a landscape where the tree and the sky and the grass all look like they're from different worlds.
Hmm.
So it's really hard actually to paint a landscape that looks like one coherent thing. Like I struggled with that for a long time, but it has a lot to do with color and you know, mixing the color of the sky into the color of the grass, at least the blue or whatever color that you're using in the sky has to be in the grass because the grass is a perpendicular plane that is directly receiving the light of the sky. So it's
Hmm.
like taking on that color even if you don't actually see it. So yeah, using color to like localize scenes and make them all coherent is I spend a lot of time thinking about that, yeah, and working on that.
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting point, actually. because you want to make sure that the whole image is coherent and it reads as like the same place.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Particularly like if you're using colors that are exaggerated, or like if you're painting, say, the sky like some kind of strange, vibrant, like pink, whatever, where it's not necessarily reality. It's not exactly how we'd see it. It's like you want to make sure that your work reads as a place or a person without it necessarily depicting a place or a person.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, what has creating art taught you about yourself?
Oh yeah, this is a hard question. Um, I think that um painting sort of like teaches you about yourself like retroactively.
Hmm.
Like, and I think you said in one of your other interviews, like every painting is a portrait, like
Yeah.
even if it's not a portrait.
Yes.
But every painting that you do is sort of like a self-portrait. And I thought that was just like a really cool idea, and it's really true. And like I think if you take an artist's work and you sort of look over the course of their lifetime, like it tells a story about them. And I feel the same like kind of with my work. Um, but it's not immediate. It's like years after I'll look at
Hmm.
something and I'll be like, "Oh, like this was about this and this," or um it's sort of like a gradual unfolding that happens when you're not trying to
Hmm.
do it or looking straight at it. Which I think goes back to the ambiguity piece of like not like actively trying like trying to not, how do I explain this? Like, sort of talking right next to or around the point that you're trying to
Yeah.
make rather than just like hitting it on the head or like smacking somebody in the face with it. But I think that like, yeah, the learning process about yourself that happens with painting is like that, where um you only really see things unfolding over time. Um and I think like it's taught me that well, and this is really like cliche, but like when I'm really sad or like if something has happened that has like really deeply hurt me, the paintings get like better, which is like a really like such an
Okay.
artist trope that like you have to be in pain or suffering. I don't think you have to be suffering, but
Yeah.
I do think like when I'm really grappling with something, the paintings become more interesting. Um which is sort of like a toxic cycle to be in, but
Yes.
it's true. Like, it's just, like, what it is.
Why is that though?
I don't know, and okay, I'm gonna qualify that and say, I don't think that that means that you can't make good art if you're
Oh,
happy.
yeah, of course, absolutely. But I feel like I wonder if it's
Um,
just because like the work, it becomes like therapy for you to work out, your problems. And
yeah,
because of it, maybe because it's a distraction from what you're grappling with, or like the
yeah,
what you're grappling with will feed into the work itself. But because so yeah, I think maybe because what you're dealing with will feed into the work, and because whatever you're dealing with is most likely going to be like a universal theme that other people are feeling, that will then therefore make the work better. Not that you need to be doing that with the work, but that will make the work better or quote unquote more interesting. Because people would understand you created it in a time of like duress, or you created it in a time where you weren't so happy. Because you can tell through the brushstrokes how an artist is feeling.
yeah, 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 you can kind of impose your own things that you're grappling with onto something that is created, like, from a place of, depth, like,
Hmm.
emotional depth. Um I don't know exactly why that happens. And I also think that like the reverse is true. Like if you create something that is from a standpoint of like, you know, true like joy and like ecstasy, like that also comes through.
Hmm.
And like people are also drawn to that. Um so I don't know. I don't know. But I think
Okay.
there's also this sort of like weird side conversations that happens with artists a lot about like being genuine and like, oh, your
Hmm.
paintings are so genuine. And like, I never know what that means. Like, I don't really like understand. I don't know. That's a tangent, but I just think that that's like, I never know. I don't know how I would be able to tell.
I feel like it's hard to know if you don't see the work in person.
Yeah.
I feel like if you see it online, there's no way of knowing if a person even made it. to be honest, with AI
No,
nowadays, especially.
yeah,
So I think if you see it in person, I feel like you can probably get a better gauge of that. But I also still agree with you because it's like, well, what does genuine mean exactly? Because art is
yeah,
fabricated. Like the whole point is art is a construction. No matter how
so
good
true.
the painting is, it's always a construction. Even a hyperreal scene, as somebody told me the other day, a hyperreal scene is still only a person's opinion of the photograph they're copying. It's the person's impression. It's not actually the photograph. So yeah, that's a good point you raised actually. Definitely something a conversation I need to be having with people about stuff just generally. That's a really interesting kind of conversation topic. Um, I'm going to think about that actually. Um, so I have a question for you from the last artist I interviewed, which was a lovely lady called Susan Stillman. And her question for you is, do you think that sometimes skill can hold you back?
Yes. Well, okay. Uh, skill, I think school can sometimes hold you back. Which skill, like, yeah, your physical skill as an artist of like what you can and can't produce, can be stifling. And I really value uh school and education, and I think that it's extremely important for an artist to like have formal training. Um, but it is when you're in classes, for hours and hours a day, compounded over weeks and months and years, um, it it distracts you from the work that you want to make.
Hmm,
Um, and that's not to say that that process of acquiring those skills isn't valuable, because it's extremely valuable, but there is a circling back that has to happen, which can take years out of, yeah, when you get out of art school, then you begin the process of what was it again that inspired me to want to be an artist.
hmm.
Um, but yeah, and I think there's this other aspect of it of sort of, you acquire skills, which is a process of fine tuning your capacity to do something, and you work at it again and again and again until you can do the thing perfectly, whether that's playing a symphony or writing a novel or whatever that you want to acquire as your skill. But what happens then is that you've now cemented this process in your head of fine tuning it to the finest point. Whereas a lot of times the most interesting works of art are unfinished,
Hmm,
or sort of scrappy, not
hmm.
perfect. And that's what draws you in. Um, and so once you've acquired that skill to create something to perfection, you have to make a concerted mental effort then, if you want to make this sort of interesting, imperfect work, you have to then make an effort to scale that back. But I don't think that that's an argument for not acquiring the skill to begin with, because you can't get anywhere if you don't learn how to do it, you know? I think there's this argument of like, well, I don't want to go to art school because I don't want to poison my well of imagination, if you will. Um, but you're not, you're just learning a language, and then you can say what you want, how you want. But it's just a matter of balancing the two.
That's a really good consideration. I just wrote down this. There's an artist that I saw the other day, because I didn't. I'm pretty sure I saved. I'm pretty sure I saved their work in my never-ending posts, like save post, because my posts are never-ending. I've just got so much stuff saved over the years. It's not even funny. I'm like, oh, I'll message that as later. Like 5 years later, I'm like, yeah, I'll probably get around to it. But she
Yeah.
created this really beautiful painting, and like it was done like really well. And then because it was oil paint, she smudged it. So she just literally got like a rag and just wiped it into these weird, like kind of circular shapes. I'm going to send it to you. I feel like you'd really enjoy it. I'm just, while you're talking, I'm like, this is what I think Emma would enjoy. I go and write this list of people who like destroy their work, who create really beautiful work and they destroy it by like altering it in some
Yes.
way. Because I feel like that's kind of what you're talking about. This idea of like being able to do something technically perfect, but then actually doing the opposite because that's what you want to do. Like you have the skill to do that. It's like, do you know the artist Ben Ashton?
No.
Okay. Fecto, I've got to have a list for you. I hope you don't
Great.
mind.
I'm so excited.
I hope you don't. Also, that's all I do is like literally send artists to people. So
Yeah.
now I know you. Every single time I see something that I think you'd like, I'll send it to you. So
Great. Love
if you
it.
don't if you get annoyed because sometimes people do, just tell me to stop and I will. But otherwise, if every time I see something, I'm like, oh, well, I think Emma will like this. I'm going to send it over. I will always do that. I
Oh,
love keeping in
totally.
contact with people. I try and keep in contact with everybody I've interviewed. Like at least kind of at least here and there, like kind of friendly. But like it's a lot of people.
Yeah.
Actually, that smudges her work because I remember she lost her. The artist was saying that she lost like FedEx lost her like £3,000 painting or something. Um,
Oh.
which is how I found her work. And I was like, oh, that's clickbaity, but okay, cool. Um, right, okay. Let me just write that. Actually, there's something else I think you'll like as well. This is the problem with looking at so many artists. It's like I have a feeling I know the kind of work you might like. Um,
Yeah.
oh, what's her
No,
name?
that's super cool. Yeah, it's like if you don't learn, you want to make these like white washed out like destroyed paintings, but you have to make them perfectly first to destroy them and have it be something beautiful after you
Mm,
destroyed it.
yeah,
So, like you still have to be able to do something before you can get
like
into this other realm of creation.
would you because you said your work is like there's like 8 or so paintings underneath the painting that you see. Would you never just like spill terps down the painting so you see like half of it revealed underneath?
Wait, say that again. Sorry.
So, like, would you ever like spill taps down your painting or something where it would take off like a layer of the paint so we see like fragments of the image underneath?
Oh yeah, I that would be really interesting. Sometimes I'll sand out a part of the painting. I've tried to do that and then get to the layer underneath, but it's really difficult to do. I don't know that I'm like that advanced that I could like block out whole parts of
Mm.
a painting and like be okay with it. Like that's sort of a
Oh,
practice that um is hard to get to that point of being able to like I don't think I'm at the point where I could like create a perfect painting and then destroy it and then be done with it. Like that's it sounds funny, but that's really advanced, like you have to
hmm.
be in a
Oh,
really
yeah,
advanced state of creation to be able to do that.
yeah. And you have to also know that that is your end goal
Yeah.
because you'll be very precious with the fact you painted something really beautiful. That you're like, do you really want to destroy that? Unless that's literally your whole kind of the appeal of your work.
Yeah.
Because there's another artist. I'm going to stop keep writing down artists in a second. Who does that? Who will paint stuff, and it's just literally like he'll just go at it, and it's like really interesting. His work's actually really interesting. I'm just writing like a list of people who should look at. I'm so sorry.
I love it.
Um, you say that until I bombard you with like 50 different posts later on. Um, you think I'm joking? Because the problem is, I will literally go through all the people I'm following and be like, oh, actually, Emma will like this, Emma will like this, send. So you're going to have like a long list later. Just warning you now. Um,
I'm excited because I do that. I'll like comment on artists that I like and follow them and like, start conversations with them. So that's
Absolutely. Send them voice
perfect.
messages.
Yeah. Yeah.
It sounds scary, but it's not. Just ask, like, so the question I ask every artist that I meet in person and on here, I don't think I've actually asked you, which I'm probably going to ask you in a second, actually. And it's what is the biggest challenge of being an artist? Because it's a very, like, everyone always has a different opinion or a different answer. It's a very good icebreaker question. So if you're ever talking to an artist, ask them, say, what's the biggest challenge you faced this year with your work? Easiest way to get into know them and their work and what they're about and what they're interested in. Very easy way to get into like their work. Um,
That's cool.
it's like when I go to art fairs in London, I literally spend 7 hours walking around asking people the same question. That's literally how I find people to interview for the podcast, which is why a lot of the British artists I interview I've met, which is cool because that's
That
just
is
so
super
fun.
cool.
That's super fun. So, I can't go this. There's one in October, but I can't go because I'm going to be on holiday. But I'm like, yeah, I always make it an effort to go and meet people in real life as well because that's not what I normally do. And I'm like, real life interactions are also a good idea, not just staring at people over
Yeah.
Zoom. Um, so actually, I was asking a question now. Actually, so what is the biggest challenge? Wait, what is the biggest challenge of being an artist?
Yeah, it is a good question. I think for me, uh, it's a question of like motivating yourself, because the the place where artists get inspiration from is so like, I don't want to say divine, but it's a very like it feels like it's coming from somewhere else and it's completely out of your power and control. And so then when you get into this dip of not wanting to create, that's really, really hard. And like I will just physically go to my studio, which I think is why I'm so grateful to have a studio, that I'm not just like painting in my living room or something, but like when I'm in that low point where I don't feel inspired and I don't want to make anything, I just go and sit in the studio and like inevitably I'll putz and I'll do like one little thing and then at least I've done something.
Yeah,
But I feel like that is the biggest challenge, among other ones. Financially selling your work is extremely difficult. But in terms of like the creative process, there's nobody standing in your kitchen when you wake up going, well, you gotta go to the studio or else you're gonna
mm,
get fired. Like
yeah,
nobody, if you want to sit on your couch all day, you can sit on your couch all day. And like sometimes that's what you want to do. Sometimes that's what I want to do. Um, but I have to make myself go, even if I have no ideas of what I want to paint or I have no motivation. Um, it takes a tremendous amount of discipline.
mm,
Um, and which I think also is another thing that is hard to see when you're not an artist.
yeah.
Like it's easy to look at a painting and go, well, that seems like all fun and games, and um, but I think the artists that I know are actually some of the most devoted professional people that I've ever met. Because you have to juggle all of these things at the same time. You have to be creative, but you also have to be extremely um, analytical and determined and persistent. And you have to embody both of those things if you're going to be successful, I think. And so there's just so much to go into it, and we need the help of other people. But at the same time, nobody's going to like fire you from your job if you don't show up. So I think that that's the biggest challenge.
So can anybody be an artist?
Like professionally or in general?
Yeah, professionally. Well, I guess it depends on what
Profession
your, like, as I've just said earlier, very early on in this conversation, it depends on what your definition of an artist is. But I
does
guess
depend.
I
Yeah,
guess, yeah, I guess I mean professional artist, as in like you're selling work and that's your main income.
no, I don't think everyone can do it. Um, because um not everyone is built like that. Like not everyone has ideas of things to make, you know.
Mm,
There's a lot of people that that's just not in their skill set, and that's perfectly fine, and they're extremely successful in other areas of their life. But I think if you're missing that one, the creative aspect, I don't think that you can be a professional artist. And I don't, because it's sort of a way of thinking. And
mm,
like I talk to a lot of people who are like, I don't have any creative anything,
mm.
you know, um, which is again perfectly fine. But I think because of that, not everybody's suited for that profession. It's really hard even if you do have creative inspiration. But if you don't have that key ingredient, I don't think you can be a professional artist.
Yeah, fair enough. So three more questions left, just so you're aware. So,
Yeah.
in your opinion, what makes a good piece of art?
I think a good piece of art brings the viewer in touch with themselves. And I think that like the deepest point where you can reach someone is in the self, more so than any sort of like external reality. Like if you can touch someone personally through a piece of art, that's really powerful. and making someone feel something, you know,
Yeah.
is not an easy thing to do. And I think that that's like largely the function that art has today, right now, is like to make people feel something. So yeah, I think right now a good work of art is produces an emotion in someone and or makes them think twice about something or, oh hey, like, maybe I'll call that one friend that I haven't called in a while,
Hmm.
and maybe I'll like finally say the thing that I needed to say or something like that,
Yeah.
like that's what good art does, I think.
So, what was the last image or piece of media that captivated you, and what was it about that left an impression on you?
Oh, so okay, there's this painter who goes by the name Sainer. Have you heard of him?
I have.
Yeah, Sainer underscore Atam is their username on
Yeah.
Instagram. Uh, and I think that was the last artist that I found that I was like, holy shit, like
Hmm.
I don't know. I think there's always those few artists where because of the sort of work that you make, when you see their work, it's like this thing clicks in your head, and I think his work is like really, really interesting and beautiful, and um because he's making these sort of they're sort of collaged, but like the way that he's working with color is really interesting. So like it'll be a scene, but then one part of the canvas is like really tonal, and then another part is really bright, like bold color. Um which is which is a really sort of backwards way of going about building a composition when you think about value, because they're all kind of the same. They're the value scale of his paintings are sort of compressed, but the composition reads because he's working so well with color,
Hmm.
and it's it's like really advanced painting, and I think it was just like really inspiring for me to see that. And like he's obviously really good at drawing, but then he'll just like block out a whole like panel of the painting in like bright green, and there's no nuance to it at all. It's just this like square that's like bright green, and you're like, what are you doing? But it like works really well.
Hmm.
And then if you see them from far away, it's like actually really beautiful. Um, but you're always taught, like put some nuance in your color, or like if you mix a green, like mix another green that's really similar to it and then lay them next to each other. Like that's what I was always taught, like mix a warm and a cool of the same color. Uh, so it's kind of counterintuitive to like block out this giant space in the canvas and just fill it with like one solid color that has like no nuance, but it's really beautifully done. Um,
Yeah. Good choice. So, what would your younger self think about your work?
my younger self, I think like myself as a kid would be like, what is going on? But I think that like my 21-year-old self, I think would be really stoked because like I feel very in touch with my like 19, 20-year-old self when I'm painting. Because at that time, like I knew that I wanted to make these sort of surreal dreamlike paintings, but I couldn't do it. Like
Hmm.
I just didn't have the skill. And so I would try and it would just come out and like I would just be like, this is stupid. Like it doesn't I'm not communicating like the depth of actually what I'm trying to say. Um and now it's been 10 years and I feel like I've been through school and I've learned how to actually paint, and now I circled back to what I was originally wanting to make at that time. So I feel I feel connected with that person that I was at that time, yeah, when I'm making
That's
art.
that's so lovely. That's absolutely lovely, and it's nice that you circle back and you're doing what you set out to originally want to do. I think that's really good. And that's also probably why your work is the way it is and it's as impactful as it is because it's actually something that you want to do. It's not something that you're like, oh, this is trendy, let's follow this. It's like, oh, this is what I'm interested in.
Yeah. Yeah,
Right.
that's
So the last question, you'll be very happy to know, as everybody is in these interviews.
true.
But that is, what are you currently working on, and where can people find more about you and your work?
Oh, cool, cool. Currently, I'm working on a few figure paintings for a show at Abend Gallery in Denver. It's ABEND, Abend, one word. And they're doing a contemporary figurative show.
Cool.
It's called Contemporary Figuration, actually. And so I'm doing these three figure paintings that I'm excited about. I'm kind of like playing with color, like getting out of my comfort zone a little with color with those.
Good.
So that's I'm excited about those. And then you can find out more about my work on my website, which is emmakalff.com. My Instagram is emma.kalff.studio. And yeah.
Right. Okay, Emma, I'm going to leave you alone. But thank you so much for your time. I really
Yeah,
appreciate
thank you.
your time. And just honestly, you just being so lovely and honest and just honestly welcoming. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate you too. This is lovely.
That concludes my conversation with artist Emma Kalff. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions or comments about it, please send me an email over at theflyingthroughbar@gmail.com and get in touch via social media sites such as Twitter and Instagram. The Flying Through Ball podcast can be found on a variety of sites such as Spotify, YouTube, or Apple Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you like the show, please consider rating, reviewing, sharing, or subscribing on any of these platforms to help spread the word. Also, don't forget to check out theflyingthroughball.co.uk for daily art inspiration. And if you're a creative, please get in touch for a chance to be featured or interviewed. If you'd like to support the platform further, we now also have a Patreon page for monthly donations. Tiers down from £1. More information and a list of rewards can be found over at patreon.com/theflyingthroughball. Additionally, if monthly donations are not your thing, we have a PayPal for one-time donations. Once again, thank you very much for listening to this episode today, folks. And until next time, please stay safe.